There we go. Okay, it says I'm live now. Actually, I want to say hi really quick. Oh, you're not showing up on my desktop audio. That means they can't hear you. Let me see. Okay, now try.
Hello?
I think it should work now. You're probably too high, though, based on what this thing says, so...
I could check on the YouTube video itself to see if they can hear my voice.
As far as I can tell, we should be good. And the levels should be about even. This window's not the right size, though.
Okay, it is working. I've just listened to it on the YouTube page.
Alright, we are up. A little bit late. Usual amount of day. Yeah, so we had a few things we were going to discuss. One of them was I finally finished Rats of Nationalism. And then the other one was thoughts on consciousness. Basically from the ground up. All the way through to, I don't know what, the meaning of life.
Executing God's plan is how I would phrase it.
Yeah, so...
I mean, a little bit sarcastic, but yeah, well, we can get to that in a while.
Yeah, so
like,
we got some stuff planned here. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Also, sorry if you're here on Valentine's Day. No, actually, my usual thing for Valentine's Day is I typically have other single friends, so we just all go out to dinner together because we all know.
Wow.
I think it's pretty fun. I don't know. Is that sad? I think it's fun.
I'm neutral towards it. Yeah. I don't know what to say about it. That is Valentine's Day.
I'm curious to hear what Paulo's got to say about that. He's one of us, probably. Alright, I'm gonna get caffeinated. So yeah, well, the thing with Rats of Nationalism, right? I guess in a nutshell, just some speculation on what is now, I think, more than ever, a very common trope or common accusation, which is that people are, undercover federal agents who are, trying to provoke people into incriminating themselves, right? And a couple of takeaways that I thought were really interesting, right, is like whenever you hear about that, you have this idea, right, that they're just like true believers of the state and really nefarious or whatever, right? That they really believe in what they're doing. But then also this idea that, have all these workers that to them it's just kind of a 9 to 5, and that's just kind of where they ended up. So they're kind of doing a half-ass job of it too. Which is kind of just a fascinating concept and dynamic, right? The other thing, though, too, is just this idea that people who support these really, really hyperbolic things, these, like, witch hunts of going after, all the Yahtzees and freaking out over the so-called storming of the Capitol, right, and all this stuff, essentially what they're doing is just enabling the entire narrative, right, that creates this racket for what may be predominantly just people who are motivated by nothing but that financial incentive. And essentially, it's just a racket that targets people who are mentally ill, a lot of schizophrenic people, and then just, uses them as a way to extort money through the state.
And that was the part of it that was...
Yeah, that's this really sad note that it ends on, right? Because the tone of the book is pretty funny overall, right?
Well, it's very conversational.
Yeah.
He is a good writer. Like, it's a joy to read, so I thought. Yeah.
I thought it was funny when he uses an action movie to make his point, and then mentions that it's based on a book, just for the benefit of people who would dismiss an action movie reference.
Yeah, and towards the beginning, when he was talking about the secret of Nim and whatever, which he's talked about with Robert Stock before. But yeah, there was the bit that was really disturbing towards the end section where he was talking about, I think, the CIA, or, well, at any rate, federal agencies basically encouraging mentally ill people to commit terror attacks so as to act as a scapegoat for de-radicalization programs, presumably to then, at a later date, point to these scapegoats and well, basically just create a caricature of how ugly it is to be in a dissident political movement, so that they can shepherd people back towards the mainstream. And incidents of them doing this with actual schizophrenics and so on.
What's interesting about that, I adjusted my mic. I don't know if I sound any different, but it has like
You
an
sound the
adjust.
same,
It's about the same.
basically.
Okay, so it doesn't really matter. All right, well that's good to know. But yeah, they're kind of like literal modern human scapegoats in that way, right? Like you're sacrificing the goat for the benefit of trying to corral the herd around, right?
Yes.
Like
Uh,
so I don't know. I mean, I get that the whole scapegoat thing was more, I guess, symbolic, right? But yeah,
well, he talks a lot about social media as just tangentially. Recently, I watched this documentary called The Social Dilemma about how social media create these echo chambers where you're basically surrounded by people who share all the same convictions as you, and it creates this siloing effect where people essentially inhabit different realities. And the documentary was talking about how they, well, designed that to happen. And it's goes part and parcel with all the, I guess, the insidious forms of censorship that they're trying to weaponize now to take out dissident people. And one aspect of it was interesting just on Twitter was when he was talking about Tradcath Twitter as potentially being an op. Like, there was a question in it somewhere quoted from some friend of his, something to the effect of, why isn't there a Protestant Twitter the way that there is a traditional Catholic Twitter? And it's a good question. And the interesting thing about that is hardcore Catholicism in and of itself doesn't really pose any threat to the ancien regime, so to speak, in a country like the United States, because it's compatible with, well, it's more compatible anyway with their vision of rationalistic, atomized multiracialism than ethnic politics is, because you get, Catholic, Hispanics, and whatever, Latin Americans. So it makes sense that they would try to use religious fanaticism because it has this authenticity to it, because religion has declined. It has this layer of authenticity of being sort of a dissident or like an anti-modern movement to it. But it's also something that they can weaponize to prevent or curtail things that they would consider real threats to the system. And he wasn't talking about it in terms of like the whole thing just being a charade and, all of these counts are paid shills or whatever. He just meant that there's the bulk of people who are actually devout Catholics and seriously invested in it, but they're being led a certain way by operatives.
I don't think he necessarily ruled that out though, right? I think there probably is some element that kind of looks at it as like at least maybe not particularly when it comes to the Catholics, right? But in a general sense that there's like a pacifying effect, which is basically that's the Q accusation, right? That the whole thing was just a massive gay op in order to distract all of the most vigilant Americans who would have been the ones who would have risen up, right? Which of course are the old boomers, the old conspiratorial boomers. They're the ones who would have risen up. So the government designed Q specifically to to distract them for the 2.5 years that it mattered or whatever.
Yeah.
That's literally the narrative. I forgot who I was listening to that was their narrative. Which,
What
I mean,
about Q being an op? Or
well, yeah, but specifically targeting boomers because they thought boomers would be the most effective, which is
interesting.
a bit of an interesting spin on it. I think maybe they were just kind of trying to appeal to their audience.
Towards the end,
Just apparently
in pages like 78 to 80, like getting towards the end, he made a prediction. Well, I guess it's not really an amazing prediction, but it is kind of eerie in light of the Biden presidency. He says in the middle paragraph, at least on my screen, on page 78, it says, "We are only 1 or 2 elections away from being imprisoned for our views under dubious legal pretenses."
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just thought that that was rather eerie, given what's come to pass since then, and the inauguration of Biden looking like a remake of Apocalypse Now, and talking about uh, basically disbanding factions within the military who supported Trump or whatever. It is pretty like amazing.
No, totally. And I'm sure if we really think back, it's already been happening, you know? Like, it. Anyway. I did
Yeah.
want to bring up, just because you had mentioned it partly in passing, that like they're using these creative new ways of censoring things. The one that I've been noticing recently, and this one is, I guess, I don't know if you'd necessarily call it censorship, like maybe soft censorship, right? But these fucking context warnings everywhere. Um, Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah.
Something had reminded me of it, and I did look up that Ryan Falk video, right, where he was.
Well, that stuff came in on YouTube from what I remember at about the same time Twitter was doing those weird new notifications, like this claim about election fraud is disputed on anybody who questioned the established narrative. I think it was around the same time. Not suggesting that it was coordinated, but I don't know, maybe.
I realize the way I place this on the screen makes it look like I divided it this way. Like, so this is Facebook in nighttime mode, right? This is what it looks like when they have this missing context over this quote from Joe Biden where he says, "I don't work for you," saying it's missing context. So I think you probably remember when this happened, right? This was roughly like a year ago when he was still campaigning, well, quote unquote campaigning.
Yes.
Right, so he blew up at this factory worker, right? And like their exchange was Biden said the guy was full of shit, and then they were arguing about gun control for a while, and then the guy says, "You work for me," and then Biden says, "I don't work for you." So that's the context, right? The context is like so much worse than just this quote. Like this quote isn't even the. I mean, I get why they're going with this angle, right? But so
Yeah.
but like that's just an example, right, of this kind of thing that they're doing. Like why would they put this on here? That's just absolutely fucking ridiculous. It's just because there are people out there who want to try to find ways to minimize it, but like that one you really can't. If you just look at the straight facts, it's really damning, right? But the point, like, they're doing it at the same time, which is so fucking conspicuous. Yeah, because Twitter is doing
Yeah.
it with their quote tweet thing too. That was the deliberate way to try to put like a stopgap, right? Because some things you can just retweet them, some things you have to quote tweet, and they did that deliberately to slow down things that they knew would be popular. Um, and then of course, and then of course on YouTube, this is actually the first time I've seen it today. I'm just gonna pull that image up too, because you said that it didn't show up on yours, which probably
No.
because of the region or something you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I decided I'm gonna like use my computer as an American so that my like ads and things like turn normal.
I turned all of my notification settings away from Britain and just redirected everything towards random foreign countries so that it all comes up in foreign languages, and I don't get to see British news, and I don't get to see British trends in popular media. And it's improved my mental health immeasurably, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I can see that.
To just be able to screen those things out. But the notifications, the new note and content warnings and stuff, it is kind of just insidious for the reason that we've talked about before. And obviously, he gets into this a little bit. I think he actually uses the term lemmings at some point, which is kind of funny. That's one of his favorite words. The leader follower dynamic that you see endemic to most of society, and especially to clueless normies, where it's almost just kind of like the voice of God speaking to you when when you see these notifications, and the average person just takes that at face value and thinks that this is the reliable news source or whatever.
Yeah,
So
well,
yeah,
it's so specifically targeted, right? That it boggles the mind. Is that the phrase? Mind boggling. Just that somebody wouldn't notice, like, like that it's not done evenly. They're not just adding this helpful context on anything that's related to a thing, you know? Like,
no, it's transparently ideological. Um, and the thing about that is just that uh, the people that you talked, well, the people who write those content warnings or the person who came up with it just as a concept would probably deny that it was ideological in any way. It reminds me of Sean Last said this on Twitter at some point. It was something like, there's no such thing as politically neutral education. And if you think there is such a thing as politically neutral education, that just means you've been successfully brainwashed. Because it is kind of like that.
I do kind of agree, you know? I mean,
There's always
I agree and I
history is.
disagree. Like, I feel
I mean,
like it's sort of
history
true,
is
but then
like,
people use it as an excuse, you know?
yeah. Well, yeah, sure. I mean, you can try to be as objective as possible, but even if you're even if you're just trying to recount the facts, the thing about that is, history is just kind of like journalism, but like for stuff in the past, the distant past instead of the recent past, and you can't rely on historians to not have their own sorts of psychological biases. So even if you're just like recounting a timeline of events, there'll always be sort of multiple angles on it, and that opens up all sorts of opportunities for ideologues to come in and start pushing a certain narrative. I think it's something that you kind of just have to accept and then screen out ideological garbage as you see it when you encounter it online or in any other situation.
Yeah, well, and I know that a lot of people, like myself, often, you know, efforts to indoctrinate typically cause you to do the opposite. And I know there's a general trend of that, you know, when you're trying to persuade people, often they just double down on whatever they already think, you know. But apparently there's also a large class of people that, you know, really do take, you know, the authority of a teacher seriously.
Yeah, and what you're describing has been studied actually, and it's alleged to be particularly common among libertarians, from what I've heard. It's called psychological reactance, which means that I forget what the actual question was. It was on one of these psychometric personality questionnaires where moral foundations, that was it. I remember Jonathan Haidt talking about it and evaluating libertarians with respect to the different foundations. There's a question that's like, um, when other people forbid me from doing something, that's exactly what I want to do, or something to that effect. And apparently, that's a tendency that's particularly common with libertarians.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's unsurprising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, so the other thing was, well, just a couple of things. There's this bit on page 80, which I thought was very, well, it's pretty depressing, but kind of beautiful in a weird way. He's talking about the decline of America. I'll just read it. He says, perhaps a silver lining in all this is that sooner or later the feds will begin to realize that they are defending a disintegrating empire from the only people still interested in holding any semblance of it together. You still there?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, sorry. And then he goes on, as it stands, the US exists as a nation in name only, like so many once iconic brands like Sylvania and RCA, whose trademarks have been long ago gobbled up by multinational corporations to be repurposed. Occasionally, these logos are then slapped onto cheap Chinese electronics in order to market products under an American a name American consumers associate with quality. If current trends continue, the United States itself will meet the same fate. The very concept of the nation state is in its death throes. the feds are then essentially working on behalf of a soon-to-be non-existent entity. Without a clearly defined country with established boundaries, what jurisdiction is the US government even presiding over? All the agencies tasked with administrating these ops are preserving is a giant third-world international airport that's merely branded with the American flag. At the end of the day, all these online cloak and dagger shenanigans amount to is a game of mimetic charades on the deck of a pixelated Titanic. Some of these agents have begun to realize this, have to realize this. Nearly everyone has worked a job where they've had to dishonestly defend a product which didn't live up to its reputation. And then he goes on, he says, your de-radicalization efforts are undertaken at the behest of a borderless country that is $20 trillion in debt and soon to be governed by people who are openly hostile to the idea of the founders and have nothing but contempt for the nation your ancestors built. So yeah.
What's so striking about that kind of depiction is just that he's starting from the top right, and then really once it's hit the individual level, right, that's kind of where you see the manifestation of, you know, a country dying, right, when everybody's just doing work because they're following just the money, right, that's associated with the brand, even if at the individual level they're seeing that it's not the real quality. I don't know, like I think it's not coincidental that it seems to parallel pretty well and just kind of scale up.
And when Rome collapsed, people fled the city and they lived in these fortified towns, I guess, to escape barbarians or whatever, which I guess is kind of what you're seeing now to a certain extent with gated communities. But yeah, it is what it is. He listed a bunch of sources towards the end, which I checked out. One of them looked like the most interesting one. There's a paper, I think it's a PhD thesis or something, by a guy called Elstad. He references ELSTAD, and it's called Overcoming Information Operations Legal Limitations in Support of Domestic Operations. The context in which it was referenced is he's talking about how the United States government basically endeavors to find legal loopholes to so that it can basically perform psyops on the American public, even though it's ostensibly illegal. One thing it mentioned is that the internet introduced a legal ambiguity about foreign as opposed to domestic audiences, because traditionally you would perform these kinds of ops in a foreign country on a foreign population, or you would be trying to prevent the spread of foreign influence in your own country. But because of global media now, it's kind of a blurry line to draw. Because the American population are constantly exposed to global media, which is how you get these, narratives about Russian interference in American public life and whatever as a kind of scapegoat. And the paper. It basically it's a series of interviews and just all kinds of different data sources collected together, which shows instances where the bureaucratic officials of the state and whatever are basically admitting implicitly or explicitly that they are willing to do psyops on the American public. One of them's called it's called Homeland Security Presidential Directive 8, and it's quoted in the paper, the Elstad paper. It says, federal preparedness assistance will support state and local entities' efforts, including planning, training, exercises, interoperability, and equipment acquisition for major events, as well as capacity building for prevention activities such as information gathering, detection, deterrence, and collaboration related to terror attacks. So I think the the key thing there is information gathering when it's talking about like domestic homeland security and stuff. But I mean, this kind of thing's fairly common knowledge now, I guess.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing too, though. Whenever you bring this kind of stuff up, people, they throw out one thing that people will do if they're very, they're very mid-witted, very normie, is they immediately just collapse all speaking of all kinds of conspiratorial or corruption-related anything into, oh, you must be a flat earther, right? It'll be whatever's in vogue to associate with, whatever like the worst shit tier thing is. They just all collapse it into
Yeah.
one. Which
If
is
it's
why
anything, if it's anything to do with genetic differences in the brain, then it'll be phrenology. Everything I don't like is phrenology. That's the thing.
Yeah, well, and that ironically, because phrenology is apparently um, vindicated, right? To
No,
an
you're
extent.
thinking of,
Oh, I'm thinking of
I think,
physiognomy or whatever, which is
physiognomy. Yeah.
or physiognomy, which but that's more like facial expression.
Yeah. It's fascinating that there's such a thing as a left wing and a right wing face. That a computer can tell with uh, it can guess what a person's political orientation is based on their facial features and be right 70% of the time, basically, which isn't like an amazing level of accuracy. Like it wouldn't have much practical application in real life, something that was only right 7 out of 10 times. But it's still interesting that there even is such a thing as a right wing or left wing face that can be picked up as reliably as that. And it also mentioned in the paper that people aren't very good at picking up on these cues or aren't much better than a coin flip. I have a feeling, though, that that's because of their sample population that they're getting that from. That is guessing people's political views based on appearance. I'm guessing that the people are mostly normies who never pay attention to these things anyway. If you surveyed people in, our circles or any sort of anti-establishmentarian circle, I bet the accuracy rates would be closer to that of the AI. That is guessing people's political views based on their faces.
So you think it would be higher or lower than the 7 out of 10?
Just the same, about the same, or better than chance.
Yeah. I wonder. Okay, yeah.
'Cause,
So it's not phrenology that was vindicated. It's physiognomy.
because there is like the soy face. It actually is a real phenomenon. Not it seems to be anyway. Not just the ridiculous faces that they pull. Even though that seems to be quite common as well. But even when they have a completely neutral expression, it's like they they often have unusual looking eyes, which is interesting, and uh, other things probably that I can't think of right now. But yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Maybe that could be a stream as we just collect all the soy faces. Oh, that should be it. Has Face and LMS done a soy face like as a thing analysis? That would be an amazing stream. We should send him an email. I want to send him an email and see if that becomes a thing.
It would be hilarious
That would
because
be
I'm
amazing.
sure
That would be
he.
fucking legendary. That would be like the Sargon Richard Spencer stream of the year. I think is fucking Face and LMS doing a stream where he just analyzes soy face. And
Yeah,
this might be the best idea I've ever come up with. Like one day I'll
yeah.
die and on my tombstone in like parentheses after my name it's gonna say he was the one who recommended that one stream where Face and LMS reviewed all the soy faces. Kind of like
Yeah.
how when TFM dies, in parentheses up after his epitaph, it's gonna say he was the one who photoshopped smiles on Brie Larson's face.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah,
But
that's his claim to fame. That's what got him the most notoriety. He's the infamous person who, who after Brie Larson complained about being asked to smile, went ahead and photoshopped smiles onto her face because there's nothing she can do about it.
It's interesting how
That's how you have to
just
speak to normies. That's how you speak their language. You have to use Brie Larson as a medium.
uh I don't usually speak to normies, or when I do, I keep it very short and to the point. But it's like, uh, oh shit, I've lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, okay. Um, the the longest writing that I did for streams before the thing on consciousness was the really long 6,000 plus word one where I talked about Evo Psych and the Black Pill and about all these sorts of dogmas that exist even within the manosphere about intersexual dynamics, I guess. And the view that I've come round to now, which is that um, the decisive thing is actually looks hypergamy. You know, it's not the low status quote unquote men who are sexually disenfranchised. It's not the low income men who are sexually disenfranchised. It's sub five men and sub Chad men in on the look scale who are being disadvantaged for that reason. But there are all these sorts of dogmas about like the money thing. Like people will say, I remember Tucker Carlson saying something like this: women aren't going to marry men who make less money than they do, even though we have, um, you know, in the United States, I think marriages where the man makes less money is it's as common as the reverse phenomenon. And you can say that it's because of men's declining wages. So okay, they haven't got a choice now. I mean, maybe that's true, but that's not the point. The point is that this doesn't fit with the idea of money being the most decisive thing because it isn't. It doesn't seem to be creating inceldom since there is this uptake in, I guess, hypogamous marriages. And but yeah, like you know what I mean. It's one of those things that people just say and then repeat and repeat and repeat until it's treated as common knowledge. And the other thing was male feminists. Like you run into these people who will just declare that male feminists are all incels, or that being a male feminist makes you unattractive to women. Like, do you know what I mean though? Like people just say this. I haven't ever seen any real evidence for this. Um, I mean, it just by and large, it doesn't appear to be the case that soy activists are incels or singles at a disproportionate rate from what I've seen. And it's also like there's the looks confound that comes in there again because so many of them are funny looking. Um, so maybe there is some truth to the idea that male feminism it's like a sexual strategy of some kind, but the thing that they're trying to compensate for is their lack of looks.
Well, and that's kind of what I was immediately thinking, right? Was that if if you have that same group and on average they're less good looking, right? Like, you could in theory control for that, right? You have to, I guess, collect your Chad soys and then compare them to other Chads and then down through the tiers, right? Um,
Yeah,
yeah, and then see how it maps. But then there could be a personality factor in that it's also attracting people who are engaging in that strategy, right? Because it's necessarily a little bit duplicitous, right? If there's like an ulterior motive, even if that's not even like conscious, which maybe is a
yeah.
little bit unfair or uncharitable, but I'd suggest that I don't know, maybe there's something there. I don't, but would that play into like would women care? Which there's evidence suggesting that they wouldn't really.
Yeah. But
Like, I'm trying to
yeah.
think. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, it is a good. Well, I did want to backtrack just a little bit. On the point about men who make less money, right, having fewer prospects or whatever. Like I do agree, right? It's overstated, and I'm guilty of that too. I think in my presentation, I kind of just took it as something at face value. I would note though, I don't think that men like their earning potential being less. It certainly doesn't help, right? Like if we're gonna compare it to a status quo where like men kind of had the same level of earning power, or conversely to one where things are even worse, right? I think you just see, everything kind of scale in proportion, right? Like things could be better, things could be worse. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure, but it's like the
But
way
yeah, it's
some
not like a
people.
fatalistic thing. It's overplayed, and it's because it's a coping mechanism, right?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean,
Yeah.
the way some people talk in the manosphere, like, you would literally think that no man who makes less than, I don't know, 30 grand a year or something has ever had a girlfriend or whatever, which is just bizarre. Because there have always been working class families and, men who make very little money. Again, if they're good looking, are usually sexually successful from the time of like high school onwards. Um, One thing that causes, well, is a potential source of confusion might be marriage. Marriage is less common among low class people, um, lower class people, than it was in the past. But that's not necessarily, I don't think that's indicative of inceldom. It is this weird kind of a status thing where marriage is something for, uh, well, for rich people now, basically. And paternity rates in these kinds of really low income communities, or, well, in Britain, like the chav culture, you even see these whole families on welfare and so on. So yeah, it isn't the source of inceldom.
No, yeah, certainly not the source,
Yeah.
but not helping the
And
situation.
the other thing that's
Few things
interesting.
do.
So, do you remember I talked to you a while ago about So, I talked to you about this concept of homogamy, about like women, by and large, preferring partners who are similar in socioeconomic status to themselves. And what's interesting about this is that it's actually um, a trend that's sometimes complained about by leftists, um, because it used to be less so in the past. That is, in the past, it was somewhat more common for men and women with disparate incomes, very disparate incomes. That is, where the woman was making a lot less money, to come together and get married and so on. But nowadays, it's like a sort of mating rules the roost, and the people who make X amount of money just marry and hang out and associate with other people who are kind of in that same bracket across the board. And that there's something to this because it's something that leftists will even point out, and they'll complain about it because they'll say that it increases economic inequality, right? That's the narrative, because it's like if men are just marrying women who make the same money as them all the way up and down the income distribution, then there's not as much of a transfer of wealth going on from rich men to poor women as there was in the past, because it's all so endogamous now.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, because if
and
it's
that
more if
is
it's more looks oriented, yeah, then it necessarily like decreases the circulation of money, which essentially
yeah,
by definition means less money being transferred from men to women.
yeah, and common sense, you know, common sense would dictate that this is the case. Like the way these people, a lot of people in the manosphere talk, you would think it was just imagine a country with like fantastically severe income inequality, like I don't know, Brazil or something, or well, maybe Brazil isn't the best example to use, but it's a good one because it has people in it who live like a middle class existence of the kind we would recognize in the West. And then there's also people living in slums and favelas and so on. The way some people talk, you would think it was like the people who live in these like shithole shanty towns and whatever. Like, instead of marrying the guy across the street in a similar financial situation, you would think like, oh no, they're all marrying these middle class doctors from the city and whatever. But like, you know what I mean? Like, this is transparently just not reality. Like, in reality, middle-class doctors tend to marry other middle-class doctors, or, at least on the same level. So,
Right. That people just marry across instead of necessarily like up or down.
by and large, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it makes sense, right? Because those are just the circles they're gonna run in. That's just who they're
Yeah.
gonna encounter.
And it is, the crucial thing to note is that because women always have more bargaining power in the sexual market than men have, you can't say that it's men's choices that are causing this. Oh, it's because men are the ones who are choosing to marry equally financially able women or whatever instead of dating down the income distribution or whatnot. Because the rule is it's always women's choice, right? So when you see a trend like this, I don't think it makes sense to say that it's well, it's as much a function of women's choice as anything else in the sex and dating market is. So
Wait, sorry. It's as much a function as women's choice.
no, like it's women's choice in this case that's dictating these outcomes, just as it is in all other aspects of
Oh, okay.
like the
Sorry. Yeah.
dating market.
Sorry. I
Yeah.
thought you were saying this is equal to women's choice, and I'm like, no, wouldn't women's choice be the only thing? And that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I was just confused. So we
Yeah.
actually. Okay, so we went on like a big tangent, which I think is fine. The show's typically
That was
about 70%
mostly my fault.
tangents.
Sorry.
No, I think it's good stuff though, and I think it's worth the idea that there could be a streamer face and LMS reviews soy faces. But right before that though, we were talking about conspiratorial things, and there was a comment that Warlord Basil had made because they're bringing up like a different kind of a like kind of gay op for information. Which where are we? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Wouldn't PSYOPs be easier if you're outsourcing the data harvesting to corporations? Right, because at this time you were talking about examples that were from one of the sources in Rats of Nationalism, where you have all these like really crazy examples of like specific things that they've done to like target people for whatever aim, right? And like those are like very like tying someone to the railroad track style of like classic evil. Whereas this
Yeah,
one just kind of
it's
comes off, it's a little bit more kind of white collar, but then you kind of take a step back and you're like, yeah, this is the one I think, in terms of like bang for your buck, right? Effort to output, I think, and I think this is documented. I think we know that they do this shit, right? This is your standard Patriot Act shit. Which did you know? I didn't know this that Trump had let the Patriot Act expire. Apparently, I didn't look into that any further, but
I didn't know that.
yeah, I mean,
Interesting.
I think it's back right away. That might have been one of Biden's many executive orders. So
Yeah.
kind of just
Well,
proving
it's
none
like
of it fucking
the move
matters.
now will be to classify all anti-establishmentarians as domestic terrorists.
Oh, sure. I mean, I just
Uh,
cannot believe all the people who are trying to take seriously the whole January 6th is like this big deal. Like, I just don't tolerate any, I don't know, just like any talk of it as though it matters at all. I guess a
well,
person died. I don't know.
it's the logical end point of processes that have been in the works for many decades. So that's kind of the way you can look at it. Whereas I guess for people who are closer to normedom, they think this has just come out of nowhere or something.
But even from that perspective, I mean, I guess could we call this a Charlottesville 2.0? But like, who the fuck ever cared about Charlottesville? Like, that was always a nothing burger too. It's like every time a white bitch dies, everybody has to like freak out.
What about Charlottesville? Sorry, I don't follow.
Well, that was the one that everyone used to demonize the alt right and to say, oh, we have this horrible Yahtzee threat because Heather Hirely or whatever had a heart attack next to a car.
Yeah. Um.
Right,
Yeah.
and
That's
that was the scourge. That was the reason for all the censorship and all the bullshit.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
and now it's
there's
this,
only
and it's like the same thing. It's like, okay, they broke a window, walked inside a velvet rope, and like one of the cops killed a lady, and a cop died, and it's like, you know, I mean, I know I'm like the person number 1 million to point it out, right? Like, just compared to all of the violent riots over the last year, it's so silly.
yeah. Well, I mean, they have their agenda to push, so the establishment that is. So it's like you can't really expect a consistency or honesty or principles really or anything like that from them. You've just kind of got to accept that the leftist project, so to speak, is thoroughly dug in, and they'll use any methods available to them to actualize it. So, and they don't have any moral scruples about it. It's one of the funny things about the normicon right is where they'll just point out the hypocrisies of the left, and it's kind of well, it just seems so pointless because it's like they're expecting the left to concede or something, or to admit that they've gone wrong if they just point out hypocrisies, and it reflects this like fundamental difference in mentality where the left see themselves as crusading against evil, and the right don't have an equivalent attitude towards the left, which isn't a game theoretically stable situation. It just leaves them open to getting fucked, basically, by the left.
You know what though? The boomer Q types, they think they're fighting against evil. So maybe there is something to that angle, that they are the ones. What you just mentioned though reminded me of this meme I saw. I was just looking for it right now, but it's simple enough. It's a tombstone of conservatism, right? And then on the grave it reads, "Imagine if things were reversed." Like, but imagine if things were reversed, right? Like in quotes.
Yeah. Somebody said
that
in
very appropriate. Yeah, we have some
somebody
collapsitarian sentiment in the chat, which is
yeah, somebody
yeah, I get
Warlord
it.
Basil said normies think that pointing out hypocrisy actually changes something. To that I say, if you're getting away with your shit, do you care that you're called a hypocrite? Yeah, like it reminds me of one of those a political alignment test of some kind that I took ages ago, and there was a question that was like um the permissibility or the moral legitimacy or illegitimacy of political ideologies that necessitate the use of force to achieve their goals. And I do recall thinking at the time, if somebody really believed that the only way to spread their political ideology was through force, would you really think, oh, well, I guess that means I'll just give up on it now? Of course not, because you could use force and potentially get the world you want, the society that you want, especially if you see your views as being part of a sort of grand crusade against evil. So you shouldn't expect anything else.
Yeah, and yet I still find myself, feeling like I win if I just get them to admit that that they're willing to use force, and that's the center of it, right? Like, somehow it's
Yeah.
worse. Somehow it's like in both realities they're doing the same thing, but in one of them they at least acknowledge it, right? But if you're
Yeah.
gonna use force, I guess you might as well lie about it too.
Have you ever considered, just out of interest, returning to the land of your ancestors and trying to, I guess, uncook it a bit? That would be funny.
Well, but it'd be what, somewhere in Europe? I don't know, man. I don't.
I thought you were Norwegian or something, or
Yeah, no,
Swedish.
I have all kinds of choices. Mostly some of the Scandinavian ones. I could choose any of those, which I don't feel too optimistic about. I could choose Germany, or I could choose Denmark, and neither of those I don't feel too optimistic about. I might technically have a slight claim to Poland. That might be the only hope. Um, that's about it. Yeah.
Oh well. Yeah.
0% Irish, so unfortunately I cannot claim the great nation of Ireland as mine.
Oh, what a tragedy. Oh no.
I can't choose Denmark. Oh yeah. Well, at least the Danes, they like Eurovision there. I guess I would choose Sweden. No, we can't choose Sweden. Well, I guess if you choose anywhere in Scandinavia, you have their equivalents of Alaska. But then it's like, why not just choose Alaska?
Mm.
That's the meme now. Everyone's choosing Alaska. If I could just live as a tunnel person in Alaska, I think I'd be fine with that. I just
Yeah,
like
there's
slowly go
a
blind
town.
over time. I just become like a naked mole rat critter and just eat
There's
in tunnels in
th
Alaska.
there's a town in Alaska called Whittier, that's like sealed off from the rest of the world by the mountains, and you have to go through a tunnel through the mountains to get to it. It's like I guess you could think of it as sort of a primitive form of an arcology almost, because the entire town is just this one building, like this block of flats. They all live in it, and it has its own like cafe and post office and whatever just inside the building, and school. Like they've got basically everything they need for a functioning society, but it's just in one building. And there's
Nice.
like
Yeah, sounds like
a
that's
lake.
perfect.
There's a lake out front for them to go fishing and stuff. Um, and like they get all of their supplies in through the tunnel once in a while, I guess.
Oh, dude,
But
no, I shit you not. When I was in Macau, I went to a shopping mall and they painted the ceiling like the sky, right? And then they painted on the walls like a bunch of buildings and stuff. And I thought I was outside. I mean, I was like really hungover, right? Like the kind where you're still drunk, right? But I was really convinced for a couple minutes. Then I was like, oh, I didn't go outside. But I'm fine with that. Just paint the walls right, and then I'll just think I'm outside.
yeah. Either way, I mean, I've added extra detail to it just to clarify a few things since it's such a complex topic. But the 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 essay that I sent you on consciousness and the far future of the universe, I tried to like condense complex topics in, I guess, a simple-ish way. I mean, I use some philosophical lingo, which I know that you're familiar with, but for the most part, like I try to sort of use metaphors and imagery and explain things in as simple and straightforward a way as I could. Um, did it work? Did you understand it for the most part?
Yeah, I think so. We'll probably just have to stop and like chew on a few of the concepts because they're kind of named right, and then
Mhm.
some of these I'm not familiar with by name actually. Like I had to do a little bit of googling. So
Yeah,
let me see here.
panpsychism and all that.
Yeah, some of that stuff. Actually, this is one where it'd be interesting to maybe play it back for Jen and see what she thinks of it because I know we touch on some quantum consciousness and stuff, and she's
Yes, and that's around the time you recommended like a pause. I've got some extra clarifying stuff where I go into some of the more details of like the quantum mechanical aspect to it. So
I'm really glad that
yeah,
that's a theme I'm building of discussions on this channel because it's not something that I really know anything about. So it's fun that
you're really glad that you're building what now? Sorry, you cut out.
just that it's become a theme talking about things like panpsychism and quantum
Yeah,
mind body shit. Um, that's what it's called. That is technically what that's all referred to.
yeah.
Kind of like a few
Oh
weeks
well.
ago, I wish we had realized that we can just refer to the previous topic as elite theory, right? Just really neatly summarizes all of it.
Yeah. Oh
Okay.
yeah, that was really fun. I've put all of the stuff that I've written on elite theory and well everything else that I've written for these streams into like a folder on my Mega account so that so that it's backed up and I don't lose any of it. In total, I've written like 23,000 words for this channel. Like enough to fill 3 hours, I think, of an audiobook, something like that, if you read at the average speed. So, but yeah, it was all just very good fun.
You could probably you could publish them on Minds as articles.
Yeah, because the thing is that I used to post shit like this on Brandon's websites, but the thing is that they're all kind of dead, and the stuff that I write doesn't really fit neatly into any of his sites really now. Because altleft.com, that one's pretty much dead. And then other than that, he just has all these like media related sites where he writes poetry or film reviews, that kind of stuff.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm.
I like Minds because I feel like there's a good chance it'll stick around for a while. It's been around for a long time. I've started to see some more mainstream, I guess you might call them conservative ink types, like Joe Pags and stuff, like showing up on Minds, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. Do you know who Elijah Schaefer is?
Oh, I've seen the name, but I don't.
Okay. It's not worth elaborating on.
Well, let's see. So I just want to make sure I know how far. I think we're at exactly 1 hour, which is pretty good. Yeah, we're just short of 1 hour. I just want to take note of that so that later I can make a couple timestamps. But that's one that's important to get, at least at that.
So I put.
There's a chance we might not get through all of this today, but I think we'll try.
Well, I put all of mine, which is the longer one, into the just like a website that tells you how long it would take to read something if you read at the average speed, and it said, I think it was about 45 minutes or 47, something like that, to get through all of it on my end. So yeah.
Terrence says I should be cloned for space colonization. I don't think I'd be very good on a space mission. I think I'd die in like a really dumb way. You know? I feel because the space is very all or nothing, right? Space is definitely like rogue status. If at any point you fuck a thing up, you're just dead. It's such a fragile existence. I don't know. I think I'd be horrible for it. But I guess if you're cloning people anyway, you just keep trying, right? Okay, so let's see. So should I start reading, or do you want to start reading? Are we gonna read it verbatim, or do you want to hop through it? I guess you have your own notes, but I can kind of follow through with it on the screen up here.
Yeah, so I was thinking that like if you just read your version and then I'll like add stuff and you can add stuff and whatever.
Okay, that works. Alright, so this one is, the topic of consciousness has a notorious reputation in philosophy and psychology for being one of the last great mysteries, and one which, if taken seriously, has a direct line to other exotic problems, such as the fundamental nature of the universe or multiverse, what the most fundamental entities are, etc. What I've set out here attempts to trace a conceptual line from what I regard as the best contemporary theory of consciousness to various ethical questions, as well as the ultimate fate of the human species and the universe. So that's what's being set out to be done here. Let us know if it's a convincing case.
You're cutting out occasionally, like a little bit, just for like a split second or something. It happens every few seconds, but I don't know. It's probably nothing you can do.
I'm gonna make it less or more sensitive is the word, I think. I think that should be better. Okay.
Okay.
So the topic invites confusion because, apart from anything else, it is often so arcane that people cannot even mutually agree on how to use language, so setting out some definitions is important. Consciousness may be defined accurately, albeit inelegantly, as the common denominator of all things which can only be described in qualitative language, such as love, pain, and colors. I feel like this is the first part where maybe there's going to be some contention. I'm not sure.
If you finish just that paragraph, I had a note to add in there, which might be of interest.
Yeah, so it does help to immediately clarify what qualia is. So I'll just keep reading a little bit. Academics refer to ineffable raw feelings of subjectivity as qualia. Of course, this is not to say that qualia have no relationship to scientific investigation. In fact, we understand the neurophysiological correlates of emotions, such as love, fairly well, but the feeling itself is purely qualitative, and it is not understood why any matter, including brain matter, should have qualia regardless of its physical or chemical composition. Why is a molecule such as oxytocin implicated in emotions but not simpler molecules like water, etc.? It seems like question begging to simply say one of them is utilized by the brain. Alternatively, you could say, a la Thomas Nagel, that consciousness is the what its likeness of being, i.e., the what it is like to be a bat. And then if there is something it is like to be a bat, or a person, or a robot, or whatever else, it is conscious. If not, it is not. Consciousness is the source and qualia, the individual varieties of subjectivity. At times I might use the terms consciousness and subjectivity interchangeably. And I think that's fair enough. I think people do use subjectivity and consciousness interchangeably.
Yeah, so just a note here. Most people refer, when they say consciousness, they're talking about bound conscious minds representing worlds. Whereas the term qualia, like there's a nuance there where it's just like not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with conscious minds, which is another term that I'm going to go on to define. And there's two different ways that you can sort of communicate this. So strictly speaking, you would have a qualia value, which, just to give you an example of what a qualia value is, you know how if you go into Photoshop and if you're trying to edit the color of something, it gives you like a sheet with the complete color space on it, and you move around your cursor, and any point on the sheet gives you like a different hash code, and it's just represents basically a slightly different, basically every point that you can move your cursor to across that sheet represents like a different part of the color space.
Yeah, like the Roy
Every
the
tiny
value
point.
and the hue and that kind of thing. If it's
Yeah,
if it's
the exact shade and whatever, and that's what I would call a qualia value. So some very specific shade of blue, for instance, would be a qualia value, and then there's a slightly larger umbrella concept, which would be a qualia variety. So like color is a qualia variety, and then sound, and then texture, and so on. And these are only provisional, though, because it could be that there are qualia varieties that defy some of our normal concepts. Like it's conceivable that there could be something that is like halfway between color and sound qualia, for instance, which would be totally bizarre. You know, some sort of sensory modality that we've never evolved for. Um, but yeah, so provisionally, these are the categories that we have right now. Does that make sense?
I wonder if there are such things, right, that are like simultaneously, I guess, what, synesthetic, or if that's the word for it.
Yeah.
But then
Well,
maybe
we'll get.
because of the way our
Yeah.
framework is set up, it gets divided.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, because we know there's shit that's occurring and making sounds that we just don't pick up, right? You know, dog whistles. I guess
Right.
but that's not necessarily a synesthetic thing. That's just like stuff's occurring that we're not registering. But
Yeah.
but
Or
so then
the sounds. I guess
yeah.
the sounds that bats have access to with echolocation and so on.
So I'm trying to. So I thought of an objection that I think helps clarify it. Ironically, which is someone I could imagine someone arguing like, okay, well, can't you just give like the codes, like the the hash codes for the values for each of the components and the level of saturation, and then that we've now linguistically, right, or we've used terms or some sort of language to depict precisely the equivalent meaning of that particular shade of blue. But then, of course, the problem is, if you have someone who's colorblind, they're not perceiving that color, right? Giving them the description of it in those terms doesn't make the qualia arise, and I think that's one way of understanding a little bit of where that line is, at least as far as like visual things are concerned.
Yeah.
And
So
I
there's
guess this,
still
yeah, and I
like,
guess as far as oral things, right? Like things you hear, you could describe, the wavelengths and the level of decibels or whatever. It would be the same kind of deal.
well, yeah. So you could just sticking with color, just because I think it's like an easier one for people to wrap their heads around, or just like an easier example. You could train a computer to recognize the color red in like a functionalistic way, just in terms of like a detector for particular wavelengths of like electromagnetic radiation or whatever. But that's got nothing to do with the actual phenomenal experience of redness. And
Right.
we're going to get onto this later, why I don't think classical digital computers will ever be conscious. They don't have these, they don't have qualia. They won't be able to explore the state space of consciousness and whatever as we can, because they utilize different critical properties. But anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves.
All right, so we'll press on. At this point, it may be useful to distinguish consciousness from conscious minds. Conscious minds are subjects of experience, the metaphorical audience in the theater of consciousness, like ourselves. But it need not be the case that qualia themselves, experiential qualities, require conscious minds to exist. An important aspect of the theory as set out here is to distinguish the one thing from the other. Explaining consciousness scientifically and philosophically requires solutions to four problems: the hard problem of consciousness, the binding problem, the causal indetermination problem, and the palette problem. The first two of these have been discussed at length, whereas the latter two are rarely addressed. I'm just going to go ahead and copy these four into the chat just so they're listed there. And we could, like, individually kind of try to steelman each of these problems and look at them, but I think they're described. I think we'll see how well they're described, I guess, as we go through.
Yeah, and I've added more to them since this, so yeah.
All right. So the hard problem of consciousness means addressing both the how and the why of qualia. How is consciousness even physically possible? And secondarily, what adaptive purpose does it serve? It is a conundrum for the obvious reason that our current models of physics are supposed to be causally closed and complete, and yet physics is blind to subjectivity. No physical, mathematical, or neurological description of the color red will ever be sufficient to cross the explanatory gap and make red reveal itself to the colorblind person in the same way it reveals itself to the rest of us. Moreover, it is not obvious why consciousness is necessary to life or reproductive fitness at all. It is theoretically possible to conceive of an android which behaves and responds to its environment exactly as a human would, but is also not conscious. The lights are off. There is nothing it is like to be such an android. There is nothing it is like to be such an android. This concept is sometimes referred to as the philosophical zombie or P-zombie. Why aren't we P-zombies? Yeah, and this one I've heard brought up before too, right? From an evolutionary, strictly adaptive perspective, there's no particular reason why we would have the kind of consciousness that we does that experiences qualia. We could just as easily be totally physical beings that are just responding to cues. And in theory, you could make the argument that would make us even more effective, right? Is consciousness even a detriment, right? There's no particular reason that's obvious as to why it would be adaptive.
Yeah, and that second question is actually kind of outside of the scope of this paper. Like, I don't really give an answer to it, like, to exactly why consciousness evolved, other than to say that it seems to have some sort of computational function, um, integrating information, I guess, which I guess wouldn't be satisfied by zombies. But the first part is what I do go into, which is the physical aspect to it. So.
Right. I'm wondering if there's a little bit more we should discuss on this one before we come back to it, because I don't think it really comes back up at all. I don't know how necessary is it though for there to be an explanation for the hard problem of consciousness. I mean, I think isn't the obvious argument just that when you develop consciousness, you also develop incentives for, you're perceiving all kinds of other things in reality, right? Like that kind of becomes the apparatus for developing our, detection computer. Like to me, that's what I would go with. I guess at gunpoint. the, the rogue philosopher comes up to you at gunpoint and makes you solve the hard problem of consciousness. Next week it's the Fermi paradox.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the so the standard materialist view is that you need to have some sort of strong emergence to talk about consciousness like arising from non-conscious matter. But that doesn't make sense unless you're a dualist of some kind, which again we'll circle back around to that at some point.
Well,
But that
you can
implies
no,
that
but you
there's
can
this
use
like
you can be emergent in ways that are compatibilistic, right? In ways that aren't necessarily. You could characterize it either as being non-dualistic or materialistic, or you could kind of characterize it as kind of stepping around the whole question, which I don't know. I know we talk about materialism versus dualism a little bit, and to me, it's never been an obvious distinction, right? Because the first thing is presuming as kinds of things. And I've always had a problem with that as a category, you know what I mean? Kinds of things. Like
right. Well, later on, it's going to come back to the sort of the standard sorts of criteria that materialists like to point to in the human brain as being necessary for consciousness to emerge, where we talk about like we get into the USA being a single consciousness and whatever. But so yeah, like we will get to that, right?
right. Well, and I suppose this is actually going to segue straight into the next paragraph here because it's emergentism. Emergentism and eliminativism are fairly common responses. So yeah, this is a little bit of what we were just discussing. The former proposes some sort of strong emergence of consciousness from inert matter, which is untenable because, again, when physics is complete, however this is achieved, M theory, superstring theory, or whatever else, it lacks any account of how this is physically possible. This is a problem for physicalism, the doctrine that all reality is exhaustively described by the equations of physics and their solutions, without a robust theory to make room for consciousness within physics. Eliminativism is probably the easiest solution to dismiss. It simply denies that there is anything to explain, that the class of entities under the umbrella consciousness does not exist. Undergoing tooth extraction without anesthetic will quickly disabuse you of this.
I know that was kind of like
No, my
curt,
sorry,
I guess,
my tone is awful, but I think if you read it, I mean, for this in general, one advantage of being on the screen is it probably does read better if you're just looking at the text. But for the benefit of people like me who need everything read to them, I'm doing
it's fine.
But let me see. So eliminativism is distinct from emergentivism. Let me just see.
So eliminativism is basically just the idea that there's nothing to explain, or that consciousness is some kind of illusion, which I think is at least as counterintuitive as the idea that the US is conscious. So
Yeah, that just seems a little bit like a semantic dance, or kind of like winning by definition to me. It's almost like an inverted version of winning, right? Because winning by definition is just define your terms in such a way that you're technically right by definition, which sometimes is perfectly logically valid, I think. But it is also considered a fallacy. But then eliminativism just kind of feels like it's the reverse, where it's winning by definition by defining the other thing as not being there, or I guess losing. Instead of defining yourself as winning, you define the other thing as not, as losing.
yeah.
But anyway, let me just see here. Right, and the point about the tooth extraction is just like qualia matters, right? We can't just say it doesn't. And the idea that there's kind of nothing distinct worthy of I guess naming there, right, and going from there is a little bit ridiculous. That's kind of my takeaway.
Yeah.
Let's see. Alright, so let's keep on going. Oh, I did want to note here with Toto in the chat mentioned life's goal is to multiply, so perhaps consciousness is a way to keep this going. I think we should stick a pin in this because this is going to be relevant when we get to kind of the third prong of this. Because basically it looks like what's going on here is we're starting in metaphysics to build a groundwork for an epistemology and then tie kind of an ethical, you might call it a duty. No, I guess you wouldn't call it a duty, but it has that flavor. And it's an interesting thing with philosophy is that those are kind of seen as the three primary branches, but they always kind of, you always need all three of them if you're going to have any of them.
Right.
So then the fact that they're distinct branches is, it kind of calls it into question if you need to be doing all three in order to do any of them. That kind of suggests by definition that, I don't know, either there's might be a more clear way to distinguish between them, or it's just not right, or whatever. The mind is limited in its ability to process data. Maybe consciousness is a result of our limited capacity developing a more efficient problem-solving routine. Actually, this reminds me a lot of the very thoroughly critiqued, but I still defend it. First couple of chapters of Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto, she basically makes this argument, which is that our brain produces artistic representations because they're essentially shorthand for concepts that would just be too logically cumbersome. And a great example would be the concept of a forest, right? Which is one that a lot of people use, right? You have a singular concept of all of these, thousands and thousands of trees. Well, your brain can't comprehend more than, I think it's like 12 objects at once, right? So there's a point where you just kind of create this artistic shorthand of the forest, and then perhaps this suggests kind of an evolutionary advantage, right, to this consciousness making or qualia recognizing mechanism.
Right. So if you get to the end of the paragraph that you're on there, I had like a bit to add in just there as well.
The causal indetermination problem arises from another proposed solution to the hard problem, that of epiphenomenalism.
Epiphenomenalism.
Like epiphany, right? Epiphenomenalism.
No, epiphenomenalism.
This word in the chat, that word, epiphenomenal. Epiphen. Amenalism. Epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism. It's the claim that consciousness is simply a side effect of physical and biological processes, but itself has no causal power. Well, consciousness shouldn't have causal power, should it? Or does it have to?
Because...
So I guess is the idea like the pea zombie doesn't possess this thing consciousness, therefore it doesn't experience qualia, right? And then from that perspective, consciousness has causal power.
Yeah, and the thing that it goes on to say here is that if it's just an epiphenomenon, then how could it prompt us to have conversations about its own existence? So it's like self-refuting in that respect.
Okay, yeah, just because I initially took that as, well, of course consciousness doesn't cause the qualia to exist, right? If the term qualia, it presumes, right, that these things are kind of there in objective reality, that they're intersubjectively verifiable, which I think is one reason at the very beginning, right, you qualify that, like, it's so tricky to talk about, because I could totally see somebody arguing just using the term qualia prejudices us to assume there's this objective reality, right? And that might not be the way things are working. I wouldn't make that objection because I think it's ridiculous, but can't see the forest for the trees and you can't smell your own shit on your knees. I've never heard that rhymed. That's funny. Okay, so for example, an epiphenomenalist, they might claim that emotion of fear is an epiphenomenon. Epiphenomenon. There we go.
Yes.
Epiphenomenon. and that it is the biochemical secretions, adrenaline, associated with fear, rather than the emotion itself, which causes the heart to beat faster. But the cognitive complexity of consciousness alone seems unusual for something that is merely a byproduct. Moreover, if consciousness has no causal power, how can it cause us to have conversations about its existence? This is the causal indetermination problem. Right.
Okay, so
yeah.
try not to focus in too much on that example that I used that was kind of tacked on at the last minute. It's not that important. But so okay,
Well, I mean, I just
physics.
want to know. It's kind of just a logical example of we're referring to this thing and we're referring to it in a way that's not just like you're hormonal, right? Like these are they seem of a different category just by the way we refer to them, which suggests that explaining it that way is a little bit it has a shortcoming. That's what I took away from it. It doesn't really prove the point, but it's just kind of pointing to the no doneness of it.
Yeah. So what I was going to say here is that physics, if you're going to be a reductive physicalist, which I am, is supposed to exhaustively describe the properties of matter. But if you say that consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, that defies reductive physicalism because it means that there's some whole new category of properties to contend with that physics hasn't accounted for. And in that sense, we should be p-zombies if physicalism is true, except in light of my account, which I go on to describe, which preserves reductive physicalism. You could basically look at this as my attempt to save physicalism, because many people would regard abandoning it as kind of like a fate worse than death, which I'm broadly in agreement with. So physics can give an account.
Because everybody immediately says if you're going to go hardcore materialist or hardcore physicalist, therefore determinism, and then everybody like freaks out. Mm-hmm. That's typically the overall argument, as I understand it.
So physics can give an account of how the brain instantiates the color red anatomically, physiologically, etc. But this doesn't get around the explanatory gap, because neurons can be described in these sorts of causal, relational, mechanistic terms, whereas the experiential redness of red is still just qualitative in nature. And it's unclear why epiphenomenalism is so attractive, apparently, to a lot of psychologists, except that it just gets around the hard problem by saying that consciousness is like a shadow, metaphorically speaking, or by analogy, of the functionalistic activity of the brain. But even that analogy is flawed, because your shadow is perfectly visible and it has lots of effects in the world. So,
well, wait a minute. Don't they mean your psychological like shadow? They don't mean your literal shadow.
They use that as a metaphor to describe consciousness, the same way that a shadow.
You were also using it metaphorically that way. Sorry, that came off like super literally, and I was like, he doesn't literally think that meant a shadow, right? Sorry, I'm retarded.
The same way that your shadow is just like
there's my blonde. I'm like, he doesn't literally mean a shadow. God. Sorry. But I don't. Yeah. But that seems like a silly explanation too, right? So instead of arguing, oh, it's just part of secretions of biochemicals, instead they're just saying, oh no, it's just coming from shit you make up in your head, which is based on archetypes in the stars, right? Or whatever. I don't know. I mean, whenever you bring psychology into it, it just feels like voodoo at that point.
Yeah. I would agree. So do you want to continue?
Before we do have an interesting question in the chat. Can animals understand abstractions? But then also, do we think animals have consciousness? Do we want to address like an animal question before moving on, or
the short answer. The short answer
comes
is
up a little bit.
I think most of them do, in the sense that I think most animals are subjects of experience. But abstraction, I mean, it would depend on the animal, I guess, how smart they are.
Right. Well, I mean, there are humans that haven't met the bar for abstraction yet, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's fair, right? Because I think it would be a little bit ridiculous to suggest that animals don't experience qualia. It just seems very intuitively obvious that they do. Although I think that was a popular view for a while, is people who just saw animals as these things just responding to physical stimuli. And people who really honestly believe that didn't have any issues doing all kinds of like ridiculously cruel things to animals because they just kind of laughed about it
Yeah,
because they figured it's like a, it's just an automaton.
yeah, they thought they were pea zombies, basically. So
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Um. So I think that kind of clears that up. So let's see. We left off at particle ontology, right? Yeah, particle ontology, panpsychism. So ontology is a theory of being, basically. The the What's another word
theorizing
for
about
that?
what exists,
Yeah, it's what
essentially.
existence itself, to be or not to be, right? So particle ontology panpsychism, what I sometimes humorously call Lego brick panpsychism, comes close. So let's see, the literal translation from Greek is the all mind, but this has to be distinguished from animism, the notion that tables, chairs, mountains, etc. are conscious minds, um, and the notion that the universe is of one vast megamind, sometimes called cosmopsychism. So this is basically the inverted idea, right, behind this P zombie thing. That instead you imagine the absolute opposite end of the pendulum, where just like anything is given rise to anything, which is animism, which is not part of particle ontology panpsychism, which just seems like a bottom up, right, explanation of, I guess, kind of an interlocking between metaphysics and epistemology, right? That as things are building in this lower down way. I know you talk about later on things being baked into, right? Consciousness being baked into the fundamental stuff of reality, and I'm wondering,
Yes.
is that necessarily part of this panpsychism, or is that just one of many? I imagine that that's just one of many theories that are kind of compatible with it.
Well, when we get to that, I am later on going to talk about like the difference between traditional panpsychism, which is kind of what I'm talking about here, and my view, and like explain how the two are different. So,
Okay, so I should just keep moving along.
yes,
Okay. Okay, so
please.
it's Alright, so it's neither of these. Rather, it attempts to tackle the emergence problem by conjecturing that the most fundamental parts of matter, the fundamental particles of the Standard Model, as per particle ontology, have both subjective and objective aspects. This gets around emergence because if consciousness is already baked into reality at the level of fundamental entities, there is no emergence. Oh yeah, so that I should just read it instead of trying to guess what's going to happen next. So this picture still leaves both one, the binding problem and the palette problem. Okay, so before we go on to the last two problems, because I think that's going to be the bulk of what's happening here, any loose ends to tie up regarding the first two problems, which was hard problem of consciousness and then um, the... Oh no, binding problem is the second problem. Oh, and then the causal indetermination problem. Those are the two we've addressed
The
so far.
the causal indetermination problem, that one was kind of an afterthought. Like it didn't really need to be there, I guess, but I decided to put it in just for the sake of completeness.
Right, right. Well, I don't know. So, but it sounds like neither of these problems we don't really have a solution for. At least not yet.
I do.
Okay. Well,
I
I mean,
have a
what I mean is, as written here, we haven't gotten into anything like that. We just kind of described the problems, described some of the common refutations of them, and then why those refutations don't seem very satisfactory.
Yeah, and then we're going to get on to other theories and mine and David Pierce's theory. So
Okay, so we'll
yeah.
just keep on keeping on then.
Mm.
So this still leaves both the binding problem and the palette problem. The binding problem, sometimes called the combination problem, is intuitive enough. It is all very well to suppose that the 31 fundamental particles of the Standard Model encode all subjective qualities, taste, temperature, pain, love, fear, colors, etc., but how does one go from this to the unitary subjects of conscious experience that we all know? When one looks at a blue car, for example, how does the brain combine the vast array of distinct sense data involved in the experience? Edge detectors, motion detectors, color, what's this word? Proprioception?
Yeah, the
How,
second one.
what does that what does that mean? 괅ʀᴇᴍ?
It's like sort of, yeah, when you're moving through, I don't know how to describe it exactly. It's how you maintain your balance, basically, when you're moving around.
Okay. It keeps the vertigo at bay.
Yes.
And anything else that's happening in any nanosecond snapshot of the experience into a cohesive unitary perceptual field populated by dynamic objects and apprehended by a unitary sense of the self. Right, so the binding problem is like how come these conscious things aren't just like arising as just like segmented individual little blips of existence, as opposed to how it's experienced,
Yes.
which is like a continuous thing with history and memory.
Just flagging something. The next sentence, I think it's the only typo in the whole thing. That should just say "an," not "any." So.
Yep. An easy way to get a handle on how important binding is to look at syndromes in which it is even partially breaks down. For example, motion blindness. For people with this disorder, the natural flow of movement skills and motion is instead perceived as a series of frames. Or more vividly, florid schizophrenia, in which even the sense of self is fractured and experience is mangled, disjointed, and adaptively useless. Right. So it's something that's easy to take for granted, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, and just listen to fucking gamers bitching about being locked into 30 frames per second, right? Like.
Yeah. So if you read these next two paragraphs, I have just after that like an intervention that explains this even more, just to make it clearer.
Alright, so if it is possible for neurons or mind dust or whatever to accomplish this simply by virtue of the fact that they are interconnected, packed extremely close to one another, and send chemical and electrical messages to one another, then you might have to take seriously the possibility that the United States is conscious. I can't remember the name for the people who actually believe this. The United States has all the types of properties normally associated with conscious beings. Its population is interconnected and intercommunicating. It has centers of control through the state and bureaucracy. It shares genetic material. It responds to external stimuli, threats to national security. It responds to opportunities and threats, etc. Is there less information, less intelligence, less internal coordination, etc. in all this than, say, in a hamster? Bearing in mind that most people would indeed consider a hamster to be conscious. Yeah, and it's an interesting argument. So I guess, yeah, the United States, it's a pea zombie, right? I'm going to call it a pea zombie. I think that's fine.
Yeah, sure, I guess.
I don't see why not. It's a pea zombie. So why is the United States a pea zombie, but we're not, presumably? Maybe it's tempting to just give up and just say, yep, we're all pea zombies. And yet most people, including me, do not take this possibility seriously and maintain that the United States, no matter how big its population, no matter how interconnected the population was, no matter how fast the rate of information exchange or anything else, would never constitute a single conscious mind. But it isn't possible to explain why not on a view such as particle-based panpsychism without ad hoc noodling.
Either particle-based panpsychism or just traditional materialist emergentism theories. Okay, so just an even better example of binding in the brain to imagine is to imagine looking at a sheet of paper with a blue triangle and a red circle inscribed on it. You don't have to pause to work out which color is associated with which shape, unless you have a disorder such as simultanagnosia. People with simultanagnosia struggle to perceive more than one object in consciousness at once, and would thus confuse the association between the colors and the shapes that they're not directly attending to at any given moment. And classical digital computers, in the same way, you could say that they're simultanagnosic in the sense that they can scan images for objects of interest and try to isolate certain features about them. And if you ask them to search for those things, like colors, for instance, but they don't get the complete picture, so to speak. And a counter argument which might be made is that, well, our perception really isn't that unified, actually, because most people have seen that video where you have to focus on a group of people passing a ball around, just focusing on the ball. And the man in the gorilla suit walking between the people passing the ball never enters your perceptual field. You miss it.
Yeah. There's also the one where they're all like playing basketball or whatever, doing a dance, and then somebody drops a suspicious
Right.
backpack.
And people like
That
Dan
one's a
Dennett,
lot darker, obviously.
who's kind of like an eliminativist, sort of, might use this to show that binding really isn't that special. But of course, the reason, so let's just focus on visual perception for simplicity's sake. The reason that you don't pick up on every detail in your line of sight is because it wouldn't be adaptive to do so. It wouldn't be informationally useful. And that's why you have the other extreme. On one extreme, there are simultanagnostics who struggle to perceive more than one object at once. And then on the other extreme, there are some severely autistic people, for instance, who don't have perception filters and pick up on details which for most people would just blur into the background. And between the two, there's a place of unity, of binding, which is actually useful for most people in their daily life. And that's the perceptually bound visual field. It's what it looks like for most of us. So I hope that clears that up somewhat.
Well, and that's the thing is, it kind of actually ties a lot of these things together nicely. Like I imagine people who have the kind of disorder where they're not perceiving things simultaneously in a good enough way. Like one example might be somebody who, like, their vision was very severely impaired, but they were able to get like a new cure that's making them have their like full vision for the first time, right? And then people have all these questions like, ooh, like this person wasn't able to perceive this kind of a shape or this kind of a color before. What kinds of assumptions are they going to have? Are they going to be able to recognize it without having seen it before, right? And then everyone's so excited because they're going to like get an example of an answer to all these hypothetical, philosophical, masturbatory questions that normally you'd never have access to, right? And it turns out the person, like, they can't tell like the difference between like the fucking paper with the object they're supposed to see and like the wall behind them and this like strange shape that's holding it up, right? They're just like they can't fucking tell you where anything is. Like they spend the rest of their lives in fucking dark rooms because it's like they can't put it together that way, right? And I think that suggests that, with the development of the systems that we're using to I guess to grasp qualia, it does suggest, right, that like just consciousness is developing and arising almost like just right in sync with it, like it does seem to be just like, I guess, inseparable from it, if you consider the fact that like people who have these issues, usually it's like there's something that inhibited a development somewhere. I
Yeah.
don't know, I might be stretching that a little further than it's worth, but I think I will suggest that the shoe fits.
Yeah. So if you get through the next 3 paragraphs, there'll be another intervention after that.
All right, let's keep on keeping on. So, all right, so this panpsychist view does not address the palette problem. Why is conscious experience so varied and complex if its varieties map onto a particle ontology? Conventionally, there are only a few dozen types of fundamental particles in the standard model. Compare this with the staggering variety of qualia, from ordinary waking consciousness to dreaming, sleep paralysis states, and exotic drug-induced states. Why is it even possible to access the states of consciousness of, say,
DMT.
DMT.
Just say
Okay.
DMT.
DMT. The Joe Rogan drugs. When it does not seem to serve any adaptive biological purpose. Any good theory of consciousness will have to explain the binding problem and account for the diversity of qualia. To cut to the chase, the only theory to date which can resolve all these problems without resort to ad hoc justifications is what David Pearce calls physicalist idealism. It can be regarded as an update to panpsychism, which incorporates quantum physics. It is physicalistic in that it does not propose new categories of properties which are not accounted for by the standard model of physics, and still maintains that reality is exhaustively explained by the equations of physics and their solutions. However, it is idealist because it maintains that the most fundamental entities in reality are experiential in nature. This will require further elaboration. Let's see. Alright, so we'll keep on keeping on. It just feels like I should elaborate there, but I'm going to trust the text. Unlike classical Newtonian mechanics, the concept of quantum superpositions can serve as a solution to the binding problem. In quantum mechanics, the sum of all possible states of a quantum system can also be considered a valid state, hence the famous Schrodinger's cat thought experiment. The binding problem disappears if the components of each moment of experience, rather than being an amalgam of various features, processors, and their mere interconnectedness, are instead explained as neuronal superpositions, where the individual feature processors of the brain are in superposition with each other, allowing the creation of informationally sensitive Schrodinger's cat states in the brain. This process is referred to as a quantum coherence, and the idea of quantum coherence being essential to some function of the brain is called quantum mind. The idea is normally dismissed because the window of realistic superpositions is a natural narrow window, both spatially and temporally. The brain is hot enough to trigger decoherence unless the individual frames of experience are extremely brief, attoseconds or picoseconds. And since quantum systems are liable to environmental disturbances unless they are extremely small, such as the photons in the double-slit experiment, any neuronal superpositions would be interacting with matter at the level of the smallest particles to create subjects of experience. A priori, however, these are not problems with this theory. One need only assume that billions of years of evolution by natural selection were sufficient to preserve information-bearing superpositions because they were necessary for the adaptive fitness of the organism. If it sounds foreign to you, please note that there has already been talk of plants utilizing quantum coherence in the process of photosynthesis, and if organisms as simple as plants can make use of such things, there is no reason to conclude that the brains of mammals or any category of conscious minds could not do so likewise. And of course, there's bees. People use bees for this example, right? That the way that they dance suggests that they have advanced knowledge of quantum physics, right? And of course, they haven't explicated it, but perhaps that is a suggestion of quantum mind, right?
I'll add something here that relates to both that last paragraph and the next one that's coming next. So, under quantum mechanics, when you're calculating the position of, say, an electron in space, its position is actually in a superposition of multiple states, locations, which can be described using mathematically using the wave function. And you can use the wave function to read off the probabilities of each position. And we know that superposition is on solid ground because when you do the double slit experiment and fire an electron at a screen through two slits, you get a certain interference pattern, which would suggest that the electron goes through both slits at once somehow, and that's what superposition is, at least when you're not observing, but I'll get to that. So we also know that if you fire two electrons at each other, that they'll scatter off each other, but we don't know exactly how, because their trajectories are both described by separate wave functions that only give you probabilities. And yet when you switch your detector on and observe one electron, one of the two, it instantly seems to collapse the wave function of the other, no matter how far apart they are from each other, even if they're light years apart. So rather than spooky action at a distance, like the standard explanation of what's actually going on here is that once the electrons interact with each other, they cease to have separate wave functions and fall under a single wave function. And if you want to be strictly rigorous, then you have to be a wave function monist, is the technical term, and say that there's actually only one wave function, the wave function of the entire universe. And the process that I just described is called entanglement. And decoherence is basically just the name for what happens when a quantum system in superposition becomes entangled with its environment. So in the case of the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, you have this radioactive isotope that's in a superposition of decayed and not decayed, and it's entangled with the state of the detector, which is going to release some poison or whatever, depending on whether or not the atom decays, thereby killing the cat or not. Now, because we humans are made of matter, which also adheres to the laws of quantum mechanics, when we open the box and look inside, we also become entangled with the state of everything inside. So we see the cat alive and we see the cat dead, but in separate worlds. This is many worlds. Decoherence causes the wave function to branch the universe, basically. and that's the many worlds interpretation, but that's a separate issue. In order to maintain these kinds of exotic states without the wave function branching the universe, the individual frames of bound consciousness, they need to be incredibly short because the brain is such a warm system that thermal decoherence kicks in really fast. Max Tegmark estimates picoseconds or something like that. And he more or less seems to take it as read that that means quantum mind is impossible. But what I'm saying is that no, suppose that this account of quantum mind is true. How would your experience of the world be any different from, well, the way it is? Because even if you think of a movie, 30 frames per second or whatever, you don't see the individual frames. And there's also another nuance to this that's probably worth mentioning now that I think about it. So the binding problem is normally described in terms of particle-based ontologies because that's just the way people are used to thinking about it. But if you have a quantum mechanical field-based ontology, which we're going to get onto, where the entire universe works under the universal wave function, just it's all obeying the unitary Schrödinger dynamics, then it's more like a boundary problem instead, where you have to explain how the universal wave function is manifesting separate parts. What I would say, and we're going to get into this in a minute, is that instead of having a particle-based ontology, the universe is composed of fields of decohered qualia. You can maybe imagine the universe as like a tank filled with many different fluids sloshing around. So those are like the different fields. And the overwhelming majority, like 99.99% of the tank's volume, is completely smooth and featureless, except there are these tiny little bubbles of basically quantum coherent superpositions, presumably only a small minority of which have anything to do with minds representing worlds. Is that clear?
I mean, I get what you're saying, but then we still have this problem of like, why would there be superpositions? You know what I mean? Which is kind of the problem we just have in general. These double slit experiments and all this kind of bullshit. Like, it does always appear to cause a problem. When we talk about, especially when we're talking about like an approach to metaphysics and epistemology where we perceive objects and then just allow them to be as they're perceived as qualia, right? So, you know what I mean though? Like it's like everything's being set up such that the reality should be pretty consistent. So then, why do we have the superpositions? Because it sounds like this explanation isn't even based in our perception, right? This is like these actually exist.
I mean, if you're talking about why the laws of physics are the way they are, I mean, obviously, I have no idea, and I don't try to address that here, really. But yeah, it's interesting, I guess.
Yeah, so
Is that like
we are gonna have to leave some mysteries of the universe for another stream. but we should go on because I think you're right that it's not necessarily important to the broader argument. It could be, but
we'll get to it.
But yeah, so basically, as I'm understanding, just to kind of put it in a nutshell, as best I can, right, is with the classic Schrodinger's cat experiment, those are essentially, it's basically just a way of taking this superposition quantum mechanical mumbo jumbo and translating it up into, a mechanical physical reality that people can get, right, and it's taking the whole entanglement of our measuring and tying it to that consequence, right? In order to illustrate what the implications of the quantum theory are, right? And then we could understand this kind of quantum coherence model of the universe as basically like every single instance of existence is one of these potential superpositions, just as the different outcomes of the cat are, right? And we're dealing with a system of like nearly. Well, it sounds like it's limited, right? Like, so most of reality would not be characterized as a superposition. You said it's just the bubbles that show up here and there, but
well,
I just gotta wonder why that is.
Yeah, it's complicated. most of them, as I said, don't have anything to do with minds representing worlds. But this so far, it's just about the potential to use superposition as a way of hacking or solving the binding problem. That the way the brain integrates information into a unitary well, unitarily sort of bound consciousness. It's not just that they're communicating with each other or that synchronous firing or anything like this. It's actually superposition. Like the word superposition means putting things on top of each other, literally. And in the same way that you can, all different states of a quantum system mixed together can be considered a valid state. And that's basically the idea, is that the brain is utilizing superposition to stack all of these different aspects of experience on top of each other into a cohesive whole. And one thing that I didn't get into is that there should be a way to test this theoretically, which is that according to David Pearce anyway, because originally this is his idea, his kind of brainchild, I guess, is that you could train up the neural network or the detectors, presumably of the same kind that were used in the double slit experiment, to probe these extremely small spatial and temporal resolutions inside the brain. And the quantum coherent superpositions that you find should implicate exactly those feature detectors that are involved in representing whatever the current moment of experience is. So say that you're looking at a red car, the superpositions should implicate exactly those relevant feature processors, color detecting neurons or edge detectors and so on. And if it doesn't, and this is the key thing that makes it falsifiable, I guess, if it doesn't find anything like this, if it just finds computationally irrelevant noise, then the conjecture would be disproven. And at that point, well, I would be stumped in that case. Then, as far as I can tell, dualism is true. So,
Well, I mean, not necessarily. That would just mean one particular alternative to it would be proven wrong. But hey, that's good, because it's pretty rare that people straight up just present their null hypothesis. I know that's a pet peeve very often that people bring up. And
yeah.
Jen's in the chat now. It kept coming up for us, and they're like, "Oh wow!" Now that we think about it, this is a very like Jen appropriate territory that we've waded back into.
I mean, I was hoping we could continue and eventually get to what I think God would want us to do. I know I'm using that expression kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I literally do think that if there is a God, I'm 1,000% certain that this is what he wants us to do. Like the project that I go on to outline towards the end of this, where it takes on a sort of a messianic tone. But I do want to go through.
So that's the plan, yeah. So I'll try to pick up the pace here. We'll try to run through the end of what we have in these notes here to get to that. And then I think that'll be a good place for us to kind of wrap things up, and then we'll let this stream kind of sit. I'll try to go through and add a few timestamps. I'm not gonna be super detailed with it, but at least chunking out 30-minute things of it. And then yeah, Jen, it'd be interesting to have another stream with you on here, especially I imagine that basically we started this conversation on consciousness roughly 50 minutes ago. So the first hour or so was, I guess, a little bit more political and conspiratorial angled, because it was Rats of Nationalism. But yeah, so I imagine there's a lot of this that is interesting to you. Some of it may be recapping things you're familiar with, and then I imagine there's a few points that you'll have significant points of departure. So
yeah, I do want to get through all of it if possible. Do you think we could do that? Or?
Yeah. So let me see. Well, we're at about a halfway point, but I think that from here, we've gotten through a lot of the meatier stuff, or at least we've tabled the biggest objections, I think. So okay, so as for the palette problem, this requires an update to quantum field theory. This is where we are, right?
From. Yeah.
Yes. From. Okay. We're normally taught that the smallest subatomic particles are the fundamental constituents of reality, but quantum field theory suggests that this is not the case. Rather, particles are conceptualized as perturbations or excited states of underlying fields. And it is those fields which are the most fundamental reality. Without going into too much technical detail, it wasn't obvious in Newton's time why action at a distance was possible. For instance, how should the sun, 93 million miles away, have any effect on the Earth's motion when they are spatially non-contiguous? You can get around the problem if you see space, or space-time as we now understand, as a single contiguous structure rather than just being a non-entity or a medium through which objects like the sun and Earth travel, and gravity is just a perturbation within the structure. The sun is a gravitational well in space-time, and that is what affects the motion of the planets. Likewise, when you call someone, this is not action at a distance. Rather, your phone is creating perturbations in the electromagnetic field, propagating between you and the cell tower. Thus, rather than a particle ontology where the varieties of qualia are contained by the 31 standard particles, they instead map to these deeper underlying structures called fields, whose variety and complexity are not so bound and governed by different laws. Reality at the bottom is entirely composed of fields of decohered qualia, and conscious minds evolve through natural selection by exploiting quantum coherence, in which the brain mines the most fitness-enhancing qualia and combines them into a dynamically unified world simulation. This leaves no binding problem, no palette problem, no hard problem, and no problem of causal indeterminacy, since only consciousness exists and only consciousness has any causal power. I think do we need to stop there and let that point breathe a little bit?
Well, no, I'll. There's just a small paragraph here which will just like clarify that a little bit. So, if you want to integrate qualia into a physicalist worldview, if you are to be a reductive physicalist, which is what I'm trying to do, you've got to come up with some natural kind that qualia can be mapped onto, right? So the 31 standard particles seem inadequate because the diversity of qualia is so immense and you can't just mix them together like soup or something. Or like cake mixture. So what I would argue is that a very specific qualia value, such as a certain, I don't know, shade of blue, for instance, it corresponds to some natural kind, and we don't need to get into the details of that right now, but it corresponds to a natural kind at the level of these underlying fields, and our neurons instantiate them in the brain with the use of certain proteins inside those neurons, because that's just what genes are, right? They're instructions to build certain proteins. And of course, we'll have to revise our understanding of what a protein actually is in terms of quantum field theory. But I don't get into any more detail about that for the rest of this. But yeah, was any of that helpful?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that so it just kind of builds into this whole process of development that that there's an evolutionary or adaptive advantage to these things, and then it does kind of clean up a lot of these objections. So I think I'm following it. It's still a little bit new to me, but I'm.
Yep. So the idea is that we evolved to exploit these fleeting quantum coherent superpositions to which then the brain integrates qualia from, I guess, ground level reality or the most fundamental entities. It integrates the most adaptively useful qualia into a world simulation using the quantum mechanical strategies that we've talked about.
You know what's interesting is I remember I had looked just a tiny bit into American pragmatism, and I had always really hated. Like, the first thing you learn about it is they define truth as that which is useful or practical. Like, they tie a utility based definition to the truth, and like immediately that's a red flag, right, to anyone, because you say, well, no, the truth is the truth. You don't get to just say this useful thing is the truth, right? This is kind of funny because it appears that this is synergistic with that argument where you actually do argue the truth is the truth, and then here it does appear to be the case that as far as like our perceptive consciousness, the world that our mind is building, it appears that it is building one where indeed that which is useful is what's true.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's keep on keeping on. So once again, to avoid confusion, it must be stressed that this is not matrixism, the idea that reality itself is subjective. Reality is mind-independent. The mind-independent objective world described by science exists as a function of the structural relational properties of qualia and their interactions with one another, whereas consciousness is the thing in itself, the intrinsic nature of being. I wonder about this, though.
I'm gonna get onto that. Continue.
Okay.
Sorry,
All right,
being a bit curt.
all right. So just because it sounds like you're gonna agree with Kant on literally anything, and then everyone has to fight, right? This argument.
Well, not just Kant, Schopenhauer as well. He talked about the same thing.
Well,
Schopenhauer
is fine. This argument from intrinsic natures has been explicated by many philosophers. Science can describe concepts such as mass and charge in terms of their structure and mathematical relations, but it cannot tell you what actually is mass or charge. I remember once asking my science teachers about this, and without realizing it, they would give me a description of an electron in terms of its behavior and mathematical properties, and I kept saying, yeah, I get that, but what actually is it? Of course, they just shrugged their shoulders. As Stephen Hawking observed, the quantum wave function must track physical reality, but it is still only a mathematical description. We don't know what it is. The intrinsic nature, that which breathes fire into the equations, is still very much up for grabs, and if you would follow the argument set out here, the intrinsic nature is consciousness.
Okay, so just to clarify, I use the term structural relational. I think causal relational, causal hyphen relational, probably gets the point across better. So what is mass and what is charge? Mass is defined in terms of resistance to acceleration, i.e. the way something affects other objects. Charge is defined in terms of how an object behaves inside an electromagnetic field. But again, what is mass and what is charge, we don't know. One way to kind of visualize the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic properties, because it's fairly intuitive to me, but I understand that some people don't get it. One way to kind of get it across is to ask, what properties would an electron, for instance, still have if it were completely alone in the universe? How would you describe it if it wasn't traveling through any other structure or interacting with it? Nothing else was acting upon it, and it in turn wasn't affecting anything. And this is where my conjuncture comes in about consciousness, that consciousness, or strictly qualia, disclose the intrinsic nature of the physical. You might wonder, for instance, how this is different from the traditional panpsychism that I talked about earlier, the Lego brick version, which is based on a particle ontology. Because what it says is that particles are the most fundamental reality, as opposed to the quantum field theoretic ontology, which says that particles are just kind of like an epiphenomena to more fundamental structures called fields. And this is the crucial part that got to be careful with, I guess. Traditional panpsychism is property dualist, right? So it says that matter has two sets of properties: physical properties, which are described by, well, physics, and mental properties, which are opaque to physics. That's why I've kept saying that it's the idea is to reconcile all of this with while preserving reductive physicalism, as opposed to going to dualism. So what I'm saying is that it's all mental properties, right? There's only one kind of stuff, only one kind of properties. It's all mental, hence idealism. Matter's only, it's epistemically or epistemologically dualistic, because it says that there's just one set of properties, just one kind of stuff. You can observe it from the inside, so to speak, as a subjective experience, hence consciousness discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical. Or you can also observe it extrinsically from the outside, as a physicist does, in terms of its causal relational behaviors and dynamics. So, yeah.
Let's see, but is that still... I don't know though. Like, is that really a view that's based on everything arising from consciousness? It just sounds like that's just the classic problem of, everything is filtered through the consciousness. Therefore, do you know the real thing? But then, of course, it seems pretty. At least it's a popular assertion, one that I'm sympathetic to. That if you're experiencing anything, there's something out there.
Hmm.
And therefore it just necessitates that it's a physically existent thing, right? I'm not sure. Okay, so you're saying from a perspective that's based on a philosophy of epistemology, which is how do we know what we know, theory of knowledge, that kind of thing. That in that regard we might say that reality is dualistic, but then I guess is that the same though?
Two
As
forms of knowledge, as opposed to two forms of stuff or properties, basically.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Okay, because so you're creating a distinction there that's not necessarily the one that's based on like ontologically what is there, right? So
Yeah.
okay,
And there's a distinction between that and what I'm saying, which is to say that consciousness discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical. So
right, so then that there's two different approaches. One which is discourse on consciousness itself, which I don't know. I would say that that's essentially philosophy, and then the outside, explication of everything would be just what is physics or just natural sciences, hard sciences, whatever. Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, and I wouldn't even conflate that with any kind of discussion of dualism, right? Because I think that's pretty consistent, regardless of what your view is on it. Um, okay, so we have that and the mental side of things, but then this question of existence, right? Like, because isn't the easiest way to wiggle out of this to just say, well, of course we can see that like over time it was adaptive for us to recognize fields and to categorize them and to accurately depict them, right, as part of our world building mechanism that we've evolved with. But this doesn't necessarily map at all onto any discussion of like dualism, materialism, or anything, right? Because they can just as easily state like, yeah, of course our mind is manipulating or changing or responding to actual physically existent stimuli. I guess does it matter so much? That's what I'm wondering.
yeah, like I get that you're kind of just thinking out loud, but like I don't really understand your objection to this. Like we might have to come back to it some other time.
Well,
Like
I guess maybe it's just that it's coupled with certain conclusions, and I'm trying to see how it all hangs together. But then I'm wondering, are there just the extra conclusions here that we don't really need? Like, does it need to be the upgraded panpsychism? I get the explanation of kind of seeing fields and seeing qualia, right, as like objects as you experience them in reality as sort of a more fundamental block of existence, as opposed to trying to do things from a totally bottom up approach, where we're dealing with like particles and things that we can't even experience, right? I think that aspect of it, I think that carries a lot of the weight of it, without necessarily even commenting on so many other of these like huge questions that I don't know people fall either way on.
yeah, I mean, is it necessary in some ethical sense? I mean, I don't know. I guess it would depend on your ethics. I'm just trying to come up with something that
I guess okay, Jen. I
tracks
think I think
reality.
Jen nailed it, right? Because she's saying the issue that's argument is that qualia are not physically real. Well, that's my thing, right? As I'm saying, of course they're physically okay. The qualia itself is not physically real. It's being produced by your mind or whatever. Its stimulus though is, and and I think that's where I'm a little. I guess I'm caught up on that, and then there's two questions: is there a way around that, or is it just, or do we not care? You know what I mean?
Sort of. Uh, not really,
Well,
to
because
be honest.
isn't it important though that you're describing this as a fundamentally idealist explanation of all these processes, right? That it's fundamentally an ideas based thing, and I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly what that means and what are the implications
Oh
of it all.
God. Oh, right. Okay. I've just realized the source of the confusion, which is that so do you know what idealism is in terms of like in the philosophy of consciousness?
Well, I know that there's this idea
Maybe
that
I,
like ideas exist, right? That they have ontology would be one way of putting it, which isn't the most helpful way, but probably the most neutral way to describe idealism.
mm. So traditionally there's three types of monism, I guess. So there's traditional ontology, right? Three different ontologies. So you have materialism, which basically says that unconscious matter is the default, and then you have to come up with some emergentism story, which we addressed before, talking about how if materialism is true, then the US is probably conscious and so on. You have troll monism, which is what I was just talking about as the traditional panpsychist view, right? Which is the idea that there's two different kinds of, in this case, properties to matter. There's the physical and the mental, and then idealism um, means various different things, but it's the idea that it's all mental properties. So it goes all material, or broadly speaking, all material, and then um, both material and mental, and then it says, and then there's just mental, and then idealism. There's various different formulations of that. One version of it is what I call matrixism, where like basically you're in the matrix, and the idea is that the whole world is a simulation or something, or a part of somebody else's mind, or the mind of God, or some deranged thing like this. And I've taken pains to differentiate what I'm talking about from all of those things. So what I'm talking about, my view, and David Pearce's view, it's physicalistic in the sense that it preserves reductive physicalism, the idea that there's nothing in reality that isn't adequately described by the equations of physics and their solutions once we come up with, the grand theory and whatever of everything. But it's idealistic in the sense that it says that that the most fundamental entities are qualia, essentially. Qualitative properties are what's at the bottom of everything, instead of well, okay, yeah. So do you get the point?
Right. So that's the part I get. So the qualitative or qualitative entities are at the baseline of everything, as opposed to kind of their little constituent pieces that aren't really experienced. So then it's more so that in terms of like when we're trying to understand reality, those things are all necessarily linked to our consciousness, at least at an
Yeah.
individual level, right? So and then that way, as you're building that entire theory, the entire thing is like a mental construct.
Yeah.
Okay, but then yeah, I see. In the part where you're clarifying matrixism, you do note reality as mind independent. So
Yeah. So you remember I talked about quantum coherence and about the usage of that to solve the binding problem? Um, Most qualia, so basically, literally, if you look at a mountain, it's made of fields of decohered qualia, and it's when the putting of qualia together in our brains using quantum coherence to create a unitary world simulation populated by dynamic objects apprehended, however fleetingly, by a unitary self. The brain is utilizing quantum coherence to just kind of aggregate these uh, elements of basement level reality that are already just out there anyway, and just using them to create an informationally and adaptively useful world simulation. I know
right.
that's just kind of restating a lot of stuff, but does that
Yeah. So
help?
so we
Yeah.
have this kind of like material reality out there, right? We call it
Hmm.
decohered because there needs to be some kind of observation, some kind of conscious agent, right? That's then perceiving all these different qualia, and whose brain is then binding it together into part of their history and perception.
a subjective experience.
There we go. A subject, a
Yes.
non-p zombie subject, to coherentize it.
Yes,
All
by
right.
utilizing quantum coherence.
And basically, all of our discussions within any body of knowledge, whether it's hard sciences, philosophy, or anything, it's necessarily working with and involving qualia level or objects and fields, right? And therefore, it's all kind of stuck within this, I guess, conceptual realm. I guess I like it because it does have kind of a space for explaining everything. But I'm trying to think. So then but this doesn't become dualism because we've given an account of these mental processes just based on evolution, and its adaptive utility. And is this also where we're finding our purpose?
It doesn't become dualism because dualism talks about there being two sets of properties, and it doesn't allow you to have reductive physicalism because it means that there's this completely separate category of properties that hasn't been accounted for by physics. What I'm saying is that when you actually look out into the universe and you see atoms or mountains or electrons or whatever it is that you're studying, consciousness is the thing that we've been studying all along. It was actually the thing we were looking at all along, if that makes sense. Physicists study the causal relational behaviors of decohered qualia, or just of qualia, and that's what physics is. But consciousness discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, the view from the inside, so to speak, which is what we have as conscious subjects. Our brains, as subjects of experience, are instantiating a little bit of the intrinsic nature of the physical. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So then, when you're doing science, there's kind of an irony to it, right? Which is that they're attempting to reach the objective reality, right? They're trying to reach the uncohered, stuff of reality. But of course, in perceiving and dealing with it, they're necessarily subjectivizing it because it's becoming part of their consciousness. Which is why, in science, there's such great pains taken, right, to make everything objective and to have so many different repetitions and so many different perspectives and views of the same thing, because it's kind of like you need to double down on it and then eliminate down to the lowest common denominator. And that's it's funny, right? It's funny how basically like a piling on of multiple subjective experiences is our only way to unsubjectivize the experience of the objective. If that makes sense. That's a little bit of a tangent, but
yeah, it is like an irony, I guess.
Yeah, but then the bigger point, I think.
So can you just, for my I guess, sanity / peace of mind, could you kind of restate my view back to me, just like fairly briefly, just to check that we're on the same page?
Well, the gist of it I was getting at, I think, is that when we think we're doing a lot of science, we're actually studying the conscious mind, right? But because we're assuming that we're noticing things in reality, we're actually projecting things.
No. Okay, so there's a bit of confusion. I'm not necessarily talking about people who study the conscious mind. I'm saying that the stuff that's out there, whatever it is, or the consciousness is already there, sort of baked in at the most fundamental level. But like I said, most qualia that's out there doesn't have anything to do with minds representing worlds, and that's where you have to bring quantum coherence into the picture, if that makes sense.
Well, because the quantum coherence is the experience of things just coming together in a way that makes sense, right? Such that we see the objects instead of just like random constituent parts in like a disjointed way. Right.
To solve the binding
problem. Right, and that's what you mean when you say the consciousness is sort of baked in, right? Not that they have like consciousness particles inside them, right? But that there's something about the way these things are, or the way they're situated, or the relations of some of their parts that when we're going through the process of coherentizing them, they become these fields and objects that we can deal with and use. Kind of like an IKEA thing, right? Like all the pieces are in the box necessarily, right? And are, I mean, I guess it's a little bit more automatic than that.
So remember that I said that qualia are all these qualitative properties like taste, temperature, pain, etc. Right? But most of them, like I said, don't have anything to do with minds representing worlds except in our brains. I'm saying that that whole range of properties, the complete state space of consciousness, of phenomenal qualitative properties, that's there at the level of basement reality. Physicists, what they're studying, when they study atoms or electrons or whatever, they're studying the causal relational behaviors of qualia without realizing it. And our brain mines, this is the analogy I was using before, it mines the qualia varieties that are the most adaptively useful through evolution by natural selection to then integrate them into a world simulation. And the actual state space of consciousness itself pre-exists the brain in that sense. It's already there. And we haven't begun to we haven't even really begun the project of fully mapping it or exploring it. Like, we don't have a sort of a periodic table of qualia yet.
So basically, like our brick wall in terms of quantum mechanics, or perhaps the reason we don't have a unified theory, it's sort of like our mechanism for perceiving reality, right? It's just kind of interference, or it's too low resolution. And what we're actually perceiving are just kind of like the fundamental blocks of how our brains are putting together things into conscious or coherent ways.
Yeah.
And then mistaking that for things that are actually like in reality in those forms.
Yeah. The universe is composed of phenomenal simples, I guess is one way you could explain it. Qualitative simples. So yeah. So anyway, should we get on with the rest of it?
Let's keep on keeping on. All right. I'll just as long as we pause, we'll catch up with some of the comments here. So let's see. Starting a minute 56 in, I explain how. Okay. So Jen's linked to one of her videos here, which is
okay.
Another view on consciousness. So I guess her view is that qualia are derivative and cannot be axiomatized as Hameroff have done. I'm not familiar with Hameroff. Must be a particle physicist or a theoretical physicist or something like that. The issue with these theories is that it is very difficult to isolate on what level assertions are true. Oh, so she noted this a little while back, and the lowest common denominator is the measurement limit. I guess I'd have to look into a little bit more of what these terms are, but they're noted, which must be notes for things in the previous paragraph. All right, so let's keep on keeping on. So now that we have finally know what consciousness is and what the universe is made of, after 2,400 words of dense text, we may turn to some ethical implications. So this is the fun part, the truly fun part, I think. Philosophers fret about theories of ethics, but under physicalistic idealism, with consciousness as the fundamental stuff of nature, there can be little doubt that the pleasure-pain axis is the universe's inbuilt metric of value. You do not have to subscribe to any particular ethical theory to understand this. Just recognize that although it is possible to imagine an alien species a billion light years away with radically different politics, family arrangements, attitudes to education and spending, authoritarianism and libertarianism, or any other series of abstract categories, it is not possible to imagine an alien civilization with an inverted pleasure-pain axis, for whom agony is beautiful and good, and states of supreme bliss and insight are evil. The pleasure-pain axis motivates all other ethical concerns. Normal waking consciousness encourages us to think about pleasure and pain in terms of transient social phenomena, such as having sex, getting married, at graduation ceremonies, listening to music, and so on. However, these are merely the extrinsic correlates of intrinsic feelings. Subject a person on the happiest day of his life to opioid antagonists, for example, and the experience will lose all its meaning. Likewise, subject a person undergoing a typical boring day at the office to methamphetamine, and he will suddenly be hypermotivated into a frenzy of impassioned activity, the most mundane tasks suddenly becoming saturated with meaning and significance. This illustrates what is sometimes referred to as the tyranny of the intentional object, the prejudice of attributing moral significance to mind-independent events when the reality is the opposite. Qualia are the bedrock of reality, and it is the qualia of the pleasure-pain axis which saturate conscious beings with a sense of meaning and significance. Without it, there is nothing to motivate them, as can be seen from patients with injury-induced anhedonia. This is why a single 70 IQ drug user has more insight into morality and the ultimate nature of reality than all the church fathers in the entire multiverse. That could be any of the people that subscribe to my channel. We're all 70 IQ something drug users. And yet, fantastic insight into morality and the ultimate nature of reality. The continuum of qualia values from pain to pleasure is sometimes referred to as valence.
Valence.
Valence, that's right, by Emilson. What's their first name?
Andres.
Emilson, okay.
He's a mixed Swedish-Mexican.
It's an interesting combo.
Yeah.
Let's see, or hedonic tone, and it is the aspect of experience which accounts for its pleasant and unpleasant qualities, from cluster headaches to kidney stones, from the warmth of walking at the seaside on a summer's day to sex to the most sublime heights of all the human soul. Yeah, hedonic is one of my favorite new adjectives. So you describe hedonic 0 as a totally neutral state, right? And then a raising hedonic tone indicates a valence, which is pleasurable, and then a negative hedonic tone would be a valence, which is sufferable. Suffering?
Yes.
I guess not sufferable would be the opposite.
Yes.
All right. Let's keep on going. I think that's fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, the big bold assertion right here that anybody will have a problem with is, how dare you is ought or naturalistic fallacy into making the basics of ethics, suffering or or whatever, right? There's obviously the virtue ethicist people who are patiently holding their tongue. But we'll table all that for now.
So we have, when you use the term pleasure, it has all these sordid associations. But I do think it's essentially, it is basically like a single sliding scale, which incorporates, it includes anything that makes an experience intrinsically valuable or disvaluable. So on the extreme end, I guess -10 from the point of view of our brains would be, I don't know, cluster headaches or childbirth or something like that, or really bad seizures or whatnot. And then on the other extreme, you have these states like, what's interesting about it is that as you ascend into states of higher and higher conscious bliss, like in certain forms of meditation, like the jhanas, Buddhist jhana meditation, JHANA, or if you use 5-MeO-DMT, not the normal type of DMT, but specifically 5-MeO-DMT, it has this same effect where the informational content or the semantic content seems to be ever more depleted from the experience. Like people who practice the jhanas, Church of Entropy would probably be interested in this. They talk about ascending to this point where there's just this pure concentrated state of nothing, and then neither something nor nothing, and so on, and like the description just gets even weirder. It's one of those things that you would obviously have to just experience firsthand to know, kind of like we were talking about before with colorblind people experiencing color for the first time, and so on. But it could just be that this is a limitation of our brains, and that it's theoretically possible to have a civilization, for instance, where that's completely motivated by gradients of informationally sensitive well-being, where basically instead of the civilization of -10 to +10 on that we're used to in as just uh, apes that have evolved through natural selection, to a society of, say, +10,000 to +9,990. So the crucial thing is just to maintain information sensitivity and to not be blissed out, so to speak, um, outside of the constraints of our physical brains, which we'll get to later on.
Well, but that's the thing though, is that a lot of the times whenever someone dismisses a standard like this, like immediately what ends up happening, right, is you ask them, well, why is that wrong? And they say, oh, well, if we did this, right, if we were too blissed out for too long, then eventually we would be like vulnerable, and then we'd have dangers, and then we'd suffer later, right? Like very often they unaware like end up referencing this same standard in order to justify. And libertarians fall into this trap too, which is like it's always kind of bothered me that it's very very convenient that things that are pro liberty, right, and things that are in line with good generally conservative or generally right wing virtues also tend to be things that make people happy, right, and reduce suffering, and for people in general, right. That always seemed a little bit convenient, right? That it's both the principled thing, but then it's also the utilitarian thing, right? I've always been suspicious of it, but then I've never really. There's no particular reason that it can't be both things. You know what I mean? But of course, because of that, so often conservatives, quote unquote, small government types, they'll always argue from utilitarian standpoints. Even though that isn't technically supposed to be the basis of their argument, and they're technically kind of tacitly invoking, right, this sort of a suffering versus well, I guess we would call pleasure pain axis, or the suffering versus satisfaction or something.
Just the valence continuum,
there
I guess.
The valence continuum sounds both dignified and neutral.
Yeah, so just to emphasize, I'm not talking about people being blissed out, snorting cocaine or whatever, which is pathetic and just completely insignificant compared with the states that I think are possible. The key is to deal with our reward circuitry so that we have lives that are animated by gradients of informationally sensitive well-being. And the good thing about this is that it doesn't require people to give up any of their existing preference architecture in terms of something like libertarianism, for instance. You get to keep all of that and act out whatever preferences that you have, unless obviously you have a preference to create great suffering, I guess, which unless you're a psychopath, so then yeah.
Yeah, so as with most ethical propositions, that caveat seems to apply.
So, shall we go on?
Yeah, so let's see. As mentioned earlier, the brain is a world simulation machine, an experience machine, if you will, which has developed over eons of evolutionary pressure, mining the adaptionally optimal qualia varieties of bedrock reality and combining them into its simulations for various information signaling purposes. Into its simulations for various information signaling purposes. Our noses evolved to compute chemical signatures from the environment in terms of what we know as scent qualia, but it is perfectly possible to imagine an alien species for whom the same chemical sensing apparatus of the nose is instead converted into visual qualia. This isn't that crazy when you consider that there are people who can already do this. Synesthetes. Is that the word? Synesthetes for a synesthetic person? Synesthetes. Who can see sounds and smell colors, etc. Equally, when the intrepid psychonaut trips from DMT and other psychedelic compounds, he is accessing what might be termed extra-evolutionary qualia, the elements of the periodic table of consciousness which were never mined by the brain for any adaptive signaling function. The full state space of consciousness is, in effect, a vast and uncharted aspect of reality, from the hyperbolic geometrics of DMT to the exotic time fracturing and looping of Salvia Divinarium, so far known only to those stupid enough to actually take it. I've taken it.
Yeah, it's generally a bad idea from what I hear. Like, it's usually an extremely unpleasant experience.
Yeah, well, let's see. For a while, it was still legal, so any head shop you could get it, and basically, in order to smoke it, you'd have to get it really, really hot, and then you'd get like one shot, right? And it'd be pretty expensive, and then very often it wouldn't even necessarily work. Like it would have to just kind of hit you just right. But if you did trip on it, it was pretty unforgettable, but generally not pleasant. It was kind of interesting though. I've probably told this story before, but what happened to me was I was like sitting in a
Time
chair.
looping.
Well, I was sitting in a chair looking at my laptop. My laptop had had an orange background on it. And then I fell into like a square room. It was like an orange room, and I ran to the other end of the room and pushed the wall down, and then fell into an identical room. And then I was in a constant loop of like falling through orange cube rooms and pushing the wall in and falling down again. And then eventually it wore off a couple minutes later. And what I was doing was I had picked up my laptop and I was flipping it one way and then turning it back again over and over again. So that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
There were times I thought I was gonna die, but that's kind of like you know how if you put too much peanut butter on a peanut butter jelly sandwich and you take a really big bite and then you're just not sure if you're gonna make it. It's one of those kind of situations. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, the peanut butter suffocation, and you're just like so lazy and such a piece of shit that you just feel like, am I gonna be able to finish chewing this? Am I gonna have the strength to make it? Anyway,
I don't think so.
that's gonna
Anyway.
be the first weed-related death. It's gonna be a stoner on the floor in the corner, and they choked on a peanut butter sandwich because they got too ambitious. On a
Anyway.
related note, but consider the implications of the evolutionary model. We understand the underlying neurophysiology of it. I paused because I was sure I got it wrong. We understand the underlying neurophysiology of exotic states and the pleasure-pain axis to some extent. The structural, genetic, and informational properties of the brain which allow it to channel our qualia. However, our brains did not evolve to be psychonautic explorers. Those who wish to chart the complete state space of consciousness and complete the periodic table of qualia, or those who wish to eradicate all experiences below hedonic zero. Consider all the possible combinations of surgically induced, genetically engineered, or cybernetically enhanced experience, and then consider that we have barely begun to catalog the total space of simple molecules, let alone the more complex ones. Then consider that our brains may not even be physically capable of traversing the full state space. There is no reason to assume so, since there is nothing in our evolutionary history that would suggest that this goal is adaptive. Mapping the state space of consciousness, let's face it, is going to take untold billions of years, and creating the perfect psychonaut will require minds way bigger than our own, with goals bigger than mere reproduction. As technology improves and the human sphere of influence expands into space, if we are ethically serious, we are going to have to get real about how best to make use of the universe. Just as policing our cities becomes easier with the growth of surveillance technology, thus creating an ethical imperative to use technology to safeguard our citizens, just as genetic screening allows
Allows us.
there's your second typo, allows us to phase out the horrors of congenital disorders, we must consider our ethical obligations to safeguard the cosmos in light of our understanding of the pleasure-pain axis of value and advances in AI. Let's see, so we have quite a bit left. I'll keep on keeping on. We already understand with reasonable confidence how human beings can colonize the universe. We simply use 3D printing technology to create a fleet of self-reproducing solar collectors to envelop the sun and harvest all of its energy. A large asteroid or small planet is usually recommended as the building material for the collectors. Then, using giant lasers derived from sunlight, accelerate a fleet of microprobes to 99% of the speed of light and expand thus to all the reachable galaxies using nanotechnology to construct habitats along the way. The probes may carry human zygotes, about which to then construct artificial uteri upon reaching the probe's destination, and thus you have a universe-spanning civilization, given enough time. However, I think this is ethically inadequate for many reasons. The notion of an infinitely expanding universe filled with semi-sentient, scatterbrained apes ruled over by the oligarchs of neoliberalism, devising ever more ingenious ways to exploit and ruin their peoples, strikes me as a pretty horrifying future for reality. Moreover, our current understanding of physics suggests that eternalism is true, the doctrine which holds that all moments of time are equally real and constitute a fourth dimension alongside these spatial dimensions. It just happens that only the present is accessible to us. Consider the ethical implications of this. All the suffering that has ever existed in the universe is eternal, and unless time travel is possible, no respite is coming. Overcoming this, or finding a store of such immense positive ethical value that it can outweigh all this, is going to require God building, in the only true sense of the phrase, and moral projects of religious proportions. I'm not on board with this idea that things that aren't in the present or things that haven't manifested or aren't accessible also exist just as viably. Right? Like isn't accessible suffering worse than inaccessible suffering?
It's just I think it's the standard view of physics. It's been a long time since I've looked into this. So far anyway, that they talk about the block universe where time is basically just a dimension along with the spatial dimensions. So the past exists and the future exists. It just happens that they aren't accessible to us. You can see just sort of a little window into this when, if you look at like the time dilation phenomenon, like the fact that time is relative and that you can basically jump into the future by traveling really quickly across space. I'm obviously glossing over a lot of technical details there, but yeah, it's related to this, to eternalism.
Okay, so I guess another way to look at eternalism could be like, if you're looking at a wall and you can't see through it, it doesn't mean that the inaccessible physical thing that you're experiencing is not there, right? So it's kind of like, or kind of like it's in respect to time, the idea that the ball rolls behind the couch and it still exists. I don't know. I don't know in what meaningful sense though we could say that inaccessible temporal reality, quote unquote, exists if it's inaccessible. You know what I mean? Because like to be temporal and to be accessible, it's like a necessary quality of it. Is how I would say
It is. It is kind of a language problem, I guess, but maybe not strictly.
Maybe it's unimportant because I am on board with a suffering eradicating God building hedonic matrix
Right.
program.
So shall we get on to that?
So let's see what happens. Artificial intelligences using classical digital computing will never be conscious, for they do not utilize the aforedescribed quantum dynamics that are necessary for subjects of experience. However, this is not the major concern of AI safety. The problem is not that a super-intelligent AI would become conscious and self-aware and so turn against us, but that its intelligence might make it ruthlessly efficient at some project which is to the detriment of sentient life. This is what Elon Musk referred to as summoning the demon. However, just as much as this is possible, it is also possible to perform benevolent God-building through the project of AI, as long as the AI is programmed with three goals in mind. 1. To fully retro-engineer the human brain. 2. To use this knowledge as a foundation for building beings with access to the total and complete state space of consciousness. And 3. To eradicate all experience below hedonic zero while preserving life. In short, the solar system, home to perhaps quadrillions of humans going about their lives, surrounded by an ever outwardly expanding hedonium shockwave. So essentially, it's putting into motion AI, robots, whatever form they need to be in. I guess as kind of like a helicopter nanny, except it's in the form of like a supernova. extending outwards in every way in the universe, creating this essentially safe space. This is essentially the safe space universe of
Yes. Yeah.
heaven on earth. Heaven on earth
So
and
if
outside of earth and all around it.
once you get to the end, I'll tack on another bit of extra detail that'll be fun. So
I
yeah.
do want to note, it is quite funny, right, that when people bring up AI, they immediately go to these paranoid, dystopian, concepts of, oh, it's going to be iRobot, they're all going to take over. When, like, in actual reality, when you look at human technology, even AI and robotics and everything, like, the very first thing we do is we immediately, engage in automation that then gives us more value and more, like makes things better, right? Like the good examples always just so dramatically outweigh the bad ones that it's very funny that we're always so paranoid about it. We always have to go straight up Black Mirror whenever AI is involved.
Right. Mm.
I guess this is the white mirror stream.
Yeah, so to speak.
If an AI understands the value of incremental change over the instant gratification of completed goals, maybe that would work. Yeah, I mean, I could see how there could be a problem of, it's when you say eradicate all experience below hedonic zero, that alone sounds like the catchphrase of, a god mech that's going across the universe killing everything, right? But then you say while preserving life, but now we have, right, like there's some tension there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
I don't think
because
it's
most people don't want to be turned into pleasure plasma. So
yeah, right. Generally
but
speaking.
I'm talking about a way that we could preserve people's interests, and people can still hang out in their corner of the universe, but we're going to use AI to do bigger things, I guess.
I
So
suppose when you
yeah.
say preserve life, there's a sense in it where we immediately imagine life as in like there are some skin cells that are alive that we just scratched off your nose or whatever, technically alive maybe. But if we mean life in the more lifetime sense, in the more Hallmark card sense, the experiences, the friends along the way, that kind of gay shit. If the
Right.
robot's sensitive to those kinds of things, then they're attempting to preserve, all of our preference structures and everything, so that our hedonium experiences are also sensitive to our individual selfnesses.
Yeah. You're getting to the really fun part now as well, so
Physics suggests that the Catholic concept of transubstantiation is literally possible, and for a hyper-intelligent AI, trivial. The causal chain through which stars or space dust become conscious minds is, of course, complex, but we know it is possible, because here we are. And the only reason it took as long as it did is because there was no intelligence involved, and no morality except the vagaries of the evolutionary fitness landscape. We know not what the true nature of hedonium could be, what its chemical composition will be, what would be the optimal literal size of its minds, although we have to assume there would be physical constraints on it, such as the speed of light. However, we know that quantum computers, or whatever composition, could, in theory, utilize quantum coherence to produce conscious minds like our own, and better. As we busy ourselves in our remote little corner of the universe in our daily lives, the AI will reach its benevolent hands across the stars and construct the cosmos, reconstruct the cosmos, transforming the lifeless, value-neutral, hydrogenous waste of galactic space to reveal their hearts, converting all matter and energy in the visible universe into computationally optimized sentient experience machines and their batteries. Hypersentient megaminds with powers of insight, spirituality, bliss, and calculation that will make humans look less sentient than rocks. A race of perfect psychonauts ready to journey across the freshly charted topography of qualia space and qualia time with as much ease and fluidity as the traverse extrinsic space. Minds that know no suffering, minds directly plugged into heaven, minds with effectively infinite lifespans, capable of living off the energy of black holes after the end of the Stelliferous era, all the way to the ultimate heat death of the universe. There is nothing at all supernatural about this vision. All it requires is a source of energy, intelligence, and the ingeniousness of Planck tech, a technology which can rearrange matter at the smallest scales. It may even be possible for minds so far beyond ours to find loopholes in the formalisms of physics and travel to parallel realities, if you take multiverse conjecture seriously, leaving any native civilizations alone but otherwise continuing to perform their ultimate moral calling, the naturalization of heavens across all realities.
Yeah. So I said Planck tech, right? I should clarify. Normally, technology, right, is the technology that we just make with our hands, assembling a PC, for instance. Then micro tech, so that would be technology at the scale of a millionth of a meter, would be, for example, the transistors on a standard computer processing chip. And then nanotechnology, technology that can manipulate matter at the scale of a billionth of a meter. Then femto technology, a quadrillionth of a meter, so that's 1 meter times 10 to the minus 15 meters. Planck tech would be a technology that can manipulate matter at the level of, well, the Planck length, so literally the smallest entities that are observable by physics. And with this, you could perform true feats of transubstantiation. So the entities that would be at the end of this whole program that I've sketched out, they would be gods in the only sense that's meaningful. They would be omnipotent wielders of Planck tech. They would be able to remake the universe in their image. They would be omnipresent, since they would eventually fill the universe, if not the multiverse. They would be omnibenevolent and omnisentient, and they would have a roadmap of the entire state space of consciousness. They would be effectively all-knowing, because they would be able to convert, if they wanted to, whole stars, galaxies, superclusters and whatever, into computers to perform whatever computations they were interested in. And they might even be eternal, or at least as long-lived as the universe. So I've sometimes thought that if there is a God already, the only reason he could have put us here is to see if we can sort of best his creation, or to overcome some kind of great evil. And I'm now convinced 10,000% that if there is a God, this is his plan. This is what he wants us to do. He wants us to use biological intelligence to create self-improving machine intelligence. And then he wants machine intelligence to utilize nanotech, femtotech, and then eventually Planck tech to achieve feats of transubstantiation and transubstantiate the entire multiverse into an infinite pantheon of all-powerful, hypersentient gods.
So, I mean, obviously, when you state it in that way, it's a funny way to state it, right? Because if you don't mean that God literally exists, this idea, like, why would he exist and then want that? That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, the whole view kind of presumes there's nobody there to want it but humans. You know? I mean, not that I don't think it's important whether or not it's God's will. I think that's just kind of a classic way of stating, no, this is the thing that we ought to do, right? It's hard to. I mean, I guess if I'm trying to play devil's advocate, right? Because that's kind of the only way I can go about trying to truly understand it. Like, as the universe is being essentially kind of terraformed, right? But even like fundamentally terraformed in the most thorough sense of the term. Well, okay.
Except it wouldn't be terraforming, because terraforming means making other planets look like Earth. It would be more like a heaven forming, I guess.
Sure. Okay. Celestial forming. Celestial forming. Heaven crafting.
That's a good one. I like that. That last one was good. Yeah.
Or haloing.
So yeah, go on.
Halos on everything, or whatever. Anyway. Well, okay, but now we have this problem of the planet of what, algae and lab grown meats, right? Well, this is very, very efficient. Let's just keep repeating this because this is the most efficient thing. Like, how do we this concept of like it balancing all of the different subjective values of any of the people potentially involved, and being sensitive to what their predispositions are going to be as they're being planted throughout the stars, right? Like, it just seems perhaps it's too much of a maybe the hang up is just kind of missing the forest for the trees, right? But you know what I mean? Like you could see, for example, let's say you have a multiverse where this is playing out 1,000 different times. I mean, are they gonna play out identically, right? Or is there a point where these robot gods have to now make arbitrary or random decisions in order to be sensitive to equally valuable or equally plausibly valuable choices as it's heaven forming, you know?
Yeah. So, like, to preserve life like ours, do you mean?
Well, not just to preserve, right? Because this is bigger than that. It's not just it's trying to create the absolute hedonium best outcome, right? It's just trying to it's aiming to make a better and better thing. And in theory, it's going to calculate that, and it's either going to have one answer for a given situation, and it just goes through and here's my answer for this situation, and constantly does that. But then what happens when it's like there's multiple different things I could be doing, and they just seem equally valuable? And I don't experience qualia because God's a pea zombie, ironically, right?
Oh, no. That's so you've completely missed a step. I was talking about AI, so zombie AI, then going on to use recursive self-improvement techniques to then design these a new kind of artificial intelligence, I guess, or that actually
Oh, I
would.
see. So we're creating a new race of humans.
Well, not necessarily. Well, no, not
It sounds
the
like you're
actual.
making a new. It sounds like you're making an Aryan race that the robots are creating.
Well, the actual physical nature of them would be a mystery, right? That would only be, I guess, accessible to the AI that'll eventually be crafting this.
I mean, you
But
see
yeah,
the
that's why.
looming foreshadowing that naturally comes with this kind of a discussion, right? Just like, oh,
Yeah.
here's our God project for reinventing
Wait,
the
so
universe in our image.
you didn't you didn't seriously think that I was talking about like converting the whole universe into pea zombies? Like, no, that would just be horrible,
No, no,
or
no,
it would
no,
be
no.
complete.
What I thought you meant was like it's like the AI is what's going through and setting it all up, not that they've essentially created superior humans or perfected humans such that now the humans are doing it directly. I mean, I guess it's naturally got to be a combination of both because humans are just gonna automate shit. So
Yeah.
maybe that does answer my objection, is that it wouldn't be a fully automated process. But then, of course, are we at risk of recreating the dystopian neoliberal oligarchy that you referenced in the other universe, I guess?
Hmm.
Right? Are
I
we just
hope
at
not.
risk? That are we just crossing our fingers at that point? Or is the
Yeah.
second part just the promise that Trojan horse is in the thing that you were afraid of? Hmm.
Um.
Hmm.
hmm.
Hmm. There's a chin scratcher.
Yeah.
Well,
But
we've been going for a few hours here. I'm glad we got through the whole thing. Were there any other notes though that you had that or were you able to get all those in there as we were going through it?
yep. Got through everything, which is great.
Yeah, I think this is obviously a good topic to keep on the docket to revisit. I'm probably definitely giving this one a re-listen to just to I don't know, just to see where else we can take it. There's certainly
Yeah.
a number of different kind of classical philosophical problems that are acknowledged, and then we kind of leave them there because they seem like they could be interesting or relevant to the whole thing, but they could also be not relevant. so, so there are some hanging, some loose
Yeah.
ends to kind of revisit too.
Yeah. I'm glad Jen enjoyed it since this is kind of her domain, I guess. So
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear some of their takes on it. She did mention earlier that they're gonna start a weekend review later today. I have some plans for the evening. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're doing our singletons gonna have a dinner out, and they've just recently allowed people to go out to eat again over here, so we might as well take advantage of that.
The singleton, funnily enough, is actually the name for a particular AI doomsday scenario, where you just create this infinitely intelligent but unconscious AI, right? That's a P-zombie that just maximizes like paperclip production or something.
Oh yeah, it wants the singularity, and yeah, and it's got
Yeah.
that one-track mind.
Yeah.
Well, that's appropriate. How appropriate! All the flavors are just tying together in a neat little package here.
About is using zombie AI to perform essentially benevolent god building. So yeah.
And it truly would be God building. I mean, this is some Age of Aquarius shit. This is what they're all warning us about, right? But I'm inclined.
Which is
to
an
be,
irony.
That's the thing.
It's an irony.
I'm just gonna say I'm inclined to be skeptical towards those objections because I believe that there's a media bias that's causing us to think that, and I mean that just in terms of our stories and narratives. They're just kind of naturally dramatically designed to make us assume, you know, these reversals are gonna happen when it's not natural.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if it's maybe an irony that I am an Aquarius since I was born in February.
Oh yeah, how appropriate. So there we go.
Yeah.
Well, actually, yours it might have changed.
Oh, interesting.
Because did you know they added a 13th, ᴅʀᴇᴇᴍ, which is like the snake and the shield or whatever, the serpent around it, like the medicine symbol. That's the 13th sign. So I used to be a Capricorn, and I am now a Sagittarius.
Interesting.
I don't think either fit particularly well, but I don't think they don't fit particularly well, which is probably true for most people. Yeah. The Aquarius thing is pretty funny, though. Alright, so there you go, everybody. This is how the world will be saved or doomed.
Yeah.
And everybody, have a nice, happy Valentine's Day to everybody. You know, eat some chocolate. Valentine's Day is not the worst holiday, right? It's not the
Sadly,
most imposing holiday, I don't think.
I've just started dieting today, so.
All right, well, you can.
Do you know why?
Maybe look at some chocolate and just think about it. That can be just as
Do
good.
you know why I'm dieting?
Oh, why are you dieting?
Because I weigh. I just done the conversion thing on Google. Apparently, I weigh 154 pounds, which is too heavy. I want to be like 145, around there is where I like to be.
Well, that's not so bad. That's not so far to go, but.
Mm.
But yeah, you're pretty short, so.
Yep. The eternal manlet coming up with designs on how to like remake the universe.
You just gotta get right, of course. That's what it all adds up to. Is the it's just the periphery of the universe is literally robots like stretching the limbs of infants. All right, this stream's not gonna get more entertaining. It's only downhill from there, so I'm gonna go ahead and end it here. And oh, the last thing is now that I'm gonna start working, hopefully I'll keep this job. Hopefully it won't be dog shit. I'll try to schedule my streams at this time each week, but there's a chance I'll just have to make it a different time. So